Hey everybody, this is Neil Pasricha, and welcome back to chapter 132 of 3 books. Okay, this is a new one for me here. I am recording myself in my basement in video format. Because, I keep getting all these comments on my 3 books interviews on YouTube, and the comments are like, how come this only has 432 views? And so I asked my friends, how come my stuff's not going well on YouTube? And they're like, because YouTube's a video platform, and you're uploading not videos. They're just conversations that have a static picture of a guy on the top. I was like, oh, so I have to videotape the whole thing and videotape me talking about the whole thing. And they're like, yeah, that's what you got to do. All right, let's give it a shot. Here we go, everybody. Back in chapter 101 of 3 books, we had this magical eve of everything, everywhere, all at once conversation with Daniels. Daniels, of course, being Daniel Kwan, Daniel Scheinert. They went on to win Best Picture for Everything Everywhere All at Once, Best Directors, Best Screenplay, everything, okay? So we got a real moment-in-time conversation. And in that chat, back in 101, we talked about the wondrous and interesting book, Sex at Dawn, which provoked a conversation about Dunbar's number. Dunbar's number. Have you heard of Dunbar's number? It is 150, precisely. That is the cognitive limit on the number of social relationships we can have, right? So social relationships are like me knowing you, you knowing me, us knowing that the other 2 people we know each other. We have a cognitive limit on how many people we can know, how many relationships we can track, how many friendships we can give and take into, and it's 150. That number was coined by Oxford Emeritus Professor, Anthropologist, Evolutionary Psychologist, and general all-round super genius, Robin Dunbar. You guessed the last name. There are only 8 people in the world who have a number named after them, Robin says, and the other 7 people are dead. Okay, you can kind of get a sense of humor vibe from him there. Shout out to Avogadro and Planck, by the way. Now, 150 is one in a series of numbers. So, more intimately, we have 15 shoulders to cry on friends. Those are the people you would drop anything for. They would drop anything for you if some emergency happened. The reason we only have 15 is because they take a lot of time investment, right? You put a lot of time into your kids, your partner, your parents, your best friends, and they put a lot of time into you. So we only have 15 of those that we can handle. Zooming up a level, we have 50 inviting over to a big backyard barbecue friends. So if you think about who you'd invite over for a barbecue on a weekend, that's about 50. Then there is 150. That is Dunbar's number. No wonder that the average number of people who saw your Christmas card this year was 150. Average number of households is 68, by the way. But the average number of people who see your Christmas card is 150. Average size of a Neolithic Middle Eastern community 8,000 years ago, 150. Average size of people that come to your wedding or any wedding, 150. That number repeats throughout history. It's a cognitive limit, 150. You go up on a couple notches. 500 is the number of acquaintances you can have. 5,000 is the actual number of faces we can remember, which I think I just find fascinating. So we can only remember 5,000 faces total. Maybe I'm one of your 5,000. Maybe I'm not, but that's all. I could be a stranger. We don't know. Now, once you start seeing this number, Dunbar's number, it's hard to stop. And why is it important? Well, because right now we've got a loneliness epidemic. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, who joined us back in chapter 66 of 3 books, wonderful guy, he said it's a loneliness epidemic. And the Surgeon General, when he says it's an epidemic, it's an epidemic. Loneliness is worse for our health than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Okay? And 1 in 2 adults currently suffers from loneliness higher than ever before. Meanwhile, we know from the Harvard Adult Development Study, which is the longest study done on human happiness ever, since 1938 in Harvard, friendship, connection, community, these are proven to be the number 1 causes of happiness. So we have higher than ever loneliness ever. Meanwhile, we know connection and friendship makes us happier more than anything. In fact, Daniel Gilbert, in his famous 2006 book, Stumbling on Happiness, says, if I could know anything about you, everything about you, your gender, your nationality, your income, your health, all of it would fall away in face of the strength of your relationships with your friends and family. Sonia Lubomirsky at Stanford University, University of California, now says the same thing. Friendships are the number 1 driver of happiness. So enter Robin Dunbar. Wise, cheery, ever eloquent. He's got a massive mind capable of distilling this giant, complex, 5 decades of scientific work. He's got 16 books published, including How Religion Evolved and Why It Endures. And if you're watching me on YouTube, you can see me holding these books up right now. How Many Friends Does One Person Need? Dunbar's Number and Other Evolutionary Quirks. This is the first book I read by him, and I recommend it. Was in my best of 2023. If you want to find that on Neil.blog, you can. And Friends. This maybe is his I think most popular book. And it's his newest. Understanding the Power of Our Most Important Relationships. Okay, so that book, I got my notes kind of all covered over here. That book just came out in 2021. 16 books. Oxford professor, 76 years old, 5 decades of research, starting in the jungles of East Africa, where he's studying chimpanzees, then mapping what he learned about them onto another kind of primate, us. This is an astoundingly nutritious conversation. We talk about how to raise your children, what HR departments should be doing, why trust is at an all-time low in society, what you're doing wrong when you go to the gym, why religion dies during times of peace and revives during times of war, the death and finding of our deepest forms of community, Robin's 3 most formative books, and of course, much more. It is a giant, big-brained. I was catching up to this guy the whole time I was listening to him. I was like, thirsty and hungry at the same time. There's so much in here. I hope you enjoy chapter 132 of 3 books. Let's cut over to Mr. Robin Dunbar, Professor Robin Dunbar, now. Robin Dunbar, thank you so much for coming on 3 books. I'm so excited to talk to you. I have been just feasting on your books. I know you have 19 books listed under your name on Wikipedia. I was able to order and go through 4 of them. Good. And I've been listening to you on a ton of interviews. We did a podcast in chapter 101 with Daniels, the creators of Everything Everywhere All at Once. And of course, Dunbar's Number came up in our conversation of Sex at Dawn. So I thought, before we get into your 3 most formative books, could you tell us a little bit about the background of Dunbar's Number and a little bit about what you do in your work as an evolutionary anthropologist and psychologist?
Well, let's start with the second part, because that at least provides the framework. So yes, I'm an evolutionary something. I don't kind of mind what you put afterwards. It can be anthropologist, psychologist, biologist, ecologist. To me, they're kind of all the same, and mainly because what I work on and I'm interested in is social evolution, and that really sits on the interface between all these different life science disciplines, really. So from that point of view, I kind of don't really distinguish between them. So I'm interested mainly in social evolution in mammals in general, and I've worked on many different species of mammals, primates in particular. I've worked on a number of primate species, and I suppose most recently humans. And indeed, probably the first half of my career was devoted to the first 2. The second half has been devoted mainly, but not entirely, to humans. Right at the moment, I'm working on stuff on primate social evolution, in particular, but predominantly the last 20 years or so has been humans. So the question is, Dunbar's Number, where does that fit in? Dunbar's Number is a limit on the number of relationships you can manage at any one time. And by relationships here, I mean meaningful relationships, people you know and know where you stand in their social world, and they know who you are and where you stand in their social world. And it's a kind of reciprocated relationship. It's not a one-way relationship. You know them, but they have no idea who you are. This is very much meaningful relationships. And it includes all your extended family and all the people you would normally think of as friends. Now, that number's about 150 in humans, give or take a bit. Varies from one individual to another a little bit as a function of, their personality, all sorts of other things about them, I guess. Our age, gender, these kind of things. And where did this number come from? Well, it was predicted from a relationship I discovered between social group size and brain size in primates. Very late one night, I was idly wondering what this might tell us about humans. And when I plugged humans into this relationship for primates, lo and behold, the number 150 came out. So I then rushed off to the library, obviously, and spent a lot of time trying to find data on social group sizes in humans. So I looked at hunter-gatherers first, but since then, and in hunter-gatherers, it really corresponds to the size of the community or clan. So this is not people who live together at the same campsite. That's a much smaller group. It's the sort of extended group of campsites that own, if you like, territory. They have their own ranging area. So they have relationships with the kind of groups next door. There's a kind of special relationship that these related campsites will have with each other and creates this sense of a clan or a local community. But then it turned out, when we started looking further and further afield, this number just occurs all over the place.
Yeah, I recall you saying that the smaller campsites were called, in some places, bands.
Yeah.
And the predominance of what you describe as Dunbar numbers really takes off around the Neolithic, or about 8,000 years ago.
No, that number was always there. It's just that hunter-gatherers live in these dispersed social systems. The reason they do, well, we've always thought, I say we, people who are interested in these kind of things, ethnographers studying hunter-gatherers, archaeologists studying ancient campsites and so on, have always assumed that hunter-gatherers, modern hunter-gatherers and sort of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers lived in these dispersed communities because of access to food. Food competition forced them to live apart. Partly that's true, but actually we've discovered very recently that probably the much more serious problem is they just end up fighting each other if they all cram together in the same space. And so the way they solve that problem is just to split the clan up into a number of bands, which live separately. And then if you get fed up with the kind of does, as you might think of in America, you can go and live with the Smiths in the band next door and have a break from the does for a while.
Right.
That worked well until the Neolithic, when people started to try and live in settlements. That was probably because of pressure from raiding. Population sizes expanded very, very fast in the Neolithic in that sort of area of North Africa and the Near East, indeed right across through India. About 8 to 10, about 8,000 years ago, really. Mm-hmm. The climate was unusually rich. The Sahara was actually hugely well watered. There were massive mega lakes there. Lakes the size that we would even make Lake Superior look like a paddling pool. huge and huge rivers. The only one that's left of those rivers is the Nile. But the Nile we have now is, about a quarter of the size it was 8,000 years ago. And there were 4 or 5 of these rivers running across the span of the Sahara east to west. So it was extremely rich. And so population sizes exploded. People ended up sort of doing a lot of raiding, is what the historical sociologists think. And they started, therefore, living in clustering together into defendable villages just to protect themselves. And, of course, that then caused all these stresses that hunter-gatherer society was beautifully designed to avoid, just to come, to the focal point, as it were. So they had to find ways to solve the stress problems of living in compressed spaces. And we still, have to deal with those in everyday life now. The bigger your cities get, count yourself lucky in Canada. You know, you have cities of respectable size. You should try.
But they're growing fast. We're bringing 1 million new immigrants a year to Canada on a population of about 35 million, and guess what? Most of them want to live in the same 3 cities. You know?
I know. Well,
so the cities are getting denser and denser.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, you're not in the same league as Tokyo or Mexico City or Mumbai or anywhere like that yet. It will come. It will come. But the longer you can stave it off, the better. And at least you guys have some space.
Yes, exactly. Lake Superior included.
That's right. Just drain it, and you know. You know, the Dutch have a very grand tradition of draining marshes and living on them. So get some Dutch engineers over there. Yeah.
So Dunbar's number, which I've heard you say, funnily enough, there's only 8 people that have a number named after them, and the other 7 people are dead.
Yes.
So poor prognosis, but I guess that does happen over time.
Well,
150, therefore, is a maximum capacity we can hold of two-way relationships in our mind of this certain strength.
Yes.
And it's one in a, is it not one in a series of numbers?
Yes, it is. So actually, you know, if you look at your 150, it's not some kind of anonymous hive of people of all of equal relationship quality. It turns out that this number is one of a series of numbers that form a kind of hierarchically inclusive layering. And I always describe it a bit like the ripples on a pond. When you throw a stone in the lake, you know, you get these ripples running out from where the stone is, if you think of the stone as yourself. And as the ripples, as you go out with the ripples, the space occupied by the ripple gets bigger and bigger. In other words, there are more and more people, but the actual height of the ripple gets lower and lower. And you can think of that as the emotional quality of the relationship, or indeed the frequency with which you contact people. So you have those layers, but they occur in very specific numbers at 50, 15, and 5, essentially. And they extend beyond the 150 for at least 2 more, maybe 3 layers that go out to about 500, 1,500, 5,000. After 5,000, everybody is a complete stranger. You just wouldn't even know if you'd seen their photograph before or not. But the 500 layer is kind of interesting because it's kind of the layer of acquaintances. So that includes your 150, of course. So it's not extra to the 150. It includes the sort of that group of people who you see quite regularly. You probably work with a lot of them. You probably get your coffee from the barista in your favourite cafe on the way to work in the morning, if you still go to work rather than working at home. And you'll have a few words with him. You may even know a little bit about his family life, and he know a little bit about yours. And he knows who you are. He's got the moment he sees you coming down the street, he's already beginning to make your favourite concoction up for you. But you would not invite him back to your home for a big party, right? So this is
the big party test. The
big party test, and a lot of most of the people you work with will be in that category, and would probably make up quite a lot of that category. The 150 is what we've taken to describing as your kind of bar mitzvah, weddings and funerals grouping. So that big once in a lifetime thing. They would all turn up for it. In the last case, your funeral, of course, you probably don't know, but be assured, out of obligation to you, the quality of that kind of relationship, they would be there. And then coming inwards from that, the 50 layer is really your big summer party grouping. So if you were going to have kind of, I don't know, your 40th birthday party or something significant like that, at your summer house on the lake somewhere, that's the people you would invite to that, because they're a bit more meaningful than all your extended family and outer layer friends. And then the inner layer at 15 is known as the sympathy group. That's been known for a very, very long time. It's always about 12 to 15. It's the number of people who you feel emotionally very close to, such that, and the test for it is, if they died tomorrow, would you feel really upset about it, as opposed to just upset, right? And then right at the center of your world is this little group of 5 people who we call the support clique, or more casually, the shoulders to cry on friends, because these are the people who would quite literally drop everything to come and pick you up when your world falls apart. So, as I sometimes say, they would even drop the baby and come and pick you up because you're so meaningful. Whereas the people in the 15 layer would kind of go, hang on a minute, I'm just feeding the baby, or I'm just got the dinner on, or, there's some other reason why I can't make it right now, but I'll come round tomorrow. And the problem is, at that crisis in your life, tomorrow is not quick enough. You need them now. Hence the shoulders to cry on, friends. So this, and what's interesting about these numbers is they turn out to be extremely efficient than any of the numbers in between in terms of the flow of information and relationship quality around the network, your network. They also reappear in the size and structure of all these social groups of all monkeys and apes. So these all we've done is kind of add extra layers onto. Monkeys and apes don't have groups bigger than about 50 on average. I mean, you'll find one somewhere which is 100 or something like that. But these tend to be very unstable in the process of undergoing fission, splitting into 2 smaller groups. The biggest groups you have in species like chimpanzees, or the average size of groups you have in species like chimpanzees and, say, baboons, the most social of all the monkeys, is very close to 50, 45 to 50 usually. So there's something special about these numbers that makes them particularly efficient for the social world, I guess you might say.
So it sounds like we've opened up a lot of doors. I really like, as we get into your 3 books, you've taken us through the history of, what you call kind of social evolution. We've talked a little bit about your title. We've talked about the Dunbar's number and the series of numbers that both kind of precede and follow it on that the ripples from a stone falling into a lake type metaphor, which I like. You've opened up trust as a conversation topic, which I also really want to get into more on that, because I think that's fascinating. And without further ado, I also want to lead us down the rabbit hole of Robert Dunbar, Oxford Emeritus Professor, age 76, from the other side of the Atlantic's 3 most formative books. You were very kind to plumb the depths of your life and give us 3 books, 2 of which I managed to order and go through, one of which you recommend that I don't. And that is the one we're going to start with, which of course is called The Rise of the New Physics. It's Mathematical and Physical Theories by Aram Dabro. That's D''Abro. This book was published, I'm going to give the listener like a view as if they're holding this book.
Yep.
It's published in 1939 originally by Van Nostrand. 2 giant volumes with dull brown background covers and black and white images of scientists on the cover like Newton, Planck, and Einstein. Aram Dabro, almost nothing to be found about him on the internet. Very little, scant biographical information. An Armenian-American author and science writer, also known for his 1927 book, The Evolution of Scientific Thought. So this book you can file under 530 for theoretical physics, but to tell people, it is written for intelligent readers not familiar with higher mathematics, a thorough explanation in non-technical language of mathematical physical theory. So, Robin, can you please, with that little bit of background, tell us about your relationship with The Rise of the New Physics by Aram Dabro?
Yeah, it's goes back a very long way. In fact, I think it was 1968. No, it was before that. It was about 1965 when I bought the books, because I was still in high school. I hadn't gone to university. I was, at that stage, particularly interested in philosophy. I'd come from essentially a humanities background, not a science background at school. And I was very firmly in the humanities background. Science was for those who, didn't think deep thoughts. Stuff you get your hands dirty with.
Interesting.
So I was very much embedded in the humanities, and philosophy became the thing I was particularly interested in my late teens, and that's what I went to university to study. But a lot of philosophy, certainly in that period, the core to kind of philosophy as it was taught, at least in the kind of Anglophone world, but probably more generally in Europe too, was really the philosophy of physics as much as anything, particularly in the philosophy of science, was entirely the philosophy of physics. So I got very interested in, and also where I got into philosophy was through Bertrand Russell, who is a real maverick of a character, who was both an academic and later earned his living by setting up a private school, which had zero discipline for the kids. How on earth it ever survived? Can you imagine a school of sort of 13 to 18-year-olds with no discipline at all and a bunch of boys up to mischief? No wonder it never survived. Anyway, he was a very, very good writer. He actually is one of the few people who had 2 Nobel Prizes, because he had both, I think, the Nobel Prize for Literature for the quality of his writing, and I think he got the Peace Prize or something like that later in life. Anyway, Russell started out as essentially a mathematical philosopher, and he wrote with Whitehead this seminal work, Principia Mathematica, the principles of mathematics, which tried to show that mathematics, the whole of mathematics, was derived from basic logical principles. You could derive it. It's a monstrous piece of book full of equations. Don't even look. It's you'll shut the book very quickly if you were. So I was kind of well versed in this kind of heavily physics, philosophy of physics, if you like, without necessarily being a mathematician. But I came to enjoy doing maths on the side a little bit. In my last years at high school in particular, and then later at university. Not that I took any courses in it particularly, but I kind of, if you like, I'm more self-taught. But by chance, I came across these 2 volumes by Dabro in a bookstore somewhere in the philosophy section. So I thought that looked interesting and bought them. And I was just blew my mind completely, because here was the history of modern physics running from the ancient Greeks, basically, although, he left out a bunch of stuff that was done in Egypt and Iraq and India, but never mind, Here is the core to modern physics. So we have it all the way from ancient Greece, the ancient Greece philosophers, right the way through to quantum physics, which had just begun to build up by the 1930s when you wrote this book. And it was just amazing to see it step by step developing, each person building on the predecessor's shoulders, if you like. And also, he wasn't entirely shy of putting equations in there. So there are some pretty formidable equations, particularly once you get up to quantum physics, because it's all matrix algebra, and that's ferocious stuff. But if you just sort of put your mind in neutral when you see an equation and read the rest, it's just extremely well presented and thought out. And it was amazing, really, because the guy just disappeared after these volumes. Nobody knows what happened to him. Yeah. But he came from a relative...
There's 0 reviews on Amazon of the book.
Yes, no, I know. But I mean, he came from a wealthy business background. His family had businesses all over kind of Europe, and grew up mostly in Turkey and England. Went to school in England at Eton, the kind of leading and most expensive private school in the whole of Britain, and then wandered off to America. And I think he did his degrees in America. I'm sure probably Harvard or somewhere like that. In maths or physics, I can't remember, and then sort of rambled around a little bit and wrote a few books of these sort of attempts to explain to the layman the nature of science and the nature of physics, and then vanished. So wherever he is, I hope he's in, reflecting well on what a good job he did, and I'm very grateful to him because it introduced me to the power of mathematics as a backbone of the sciences, and a lot of my work since then has involved a lot of collaborations with mathematicians and physicists, and also myself doing mathematical modeling. So it was a very, very formative book.
And it helped. So you were pure humanities leading up to this book. Yeah. You read these books, and it helped steer you into more sort of sciences, and that's been foundational for your work. Yeah. What do you think about the so-called decline of liberal arts education more globally? Is that something that if you were to counsel younger people today? I'm very depressed about the decline of the humanities, because the humanities, they play an important role in other disciplines. Science is very good for dealing with, shall we say, simpler things in the world, although, clearly science can deal with very complex things. But there are aspects of the humanities and the world we live in that are probably not themselves particularly amenable to mathematical analysis. I mean, you think of literature, for example, history, all these kind of disciplines, and they play a role, and particularly things like history. History is very important to us, should be very important to us, because it's the backbone of who we are, right? If you live in a country, if you don't know the history of the country, you're always going to be on the periphery, because you won't understand why everybody else behaves the way they do. At the same time, you, whoever you are, whether you belong to that country or you've just emigrated there, have a history too from somewhere else, right? And that's really interesting to know about. From your point of view, for sure, and you should know about it. You should be interested and go away and learn it. So, all these disciplines are very much an important part of our cultural life. If we don't have them, our cultural life is going to be incredibly poor. The richness of your cultural life depends on studying and developing these humanities disciplines, and of course, understanding storytelling in different parts of the world, being one example, because it's through our shared literature and the stories they tell that we create our sense of who we are as a culture and a nation state, and indeed that kind of storytelling really plays and always has played a very important. If you look at any of the small scale societies. The First Nations in Canada or America, or the equivalent anywhere else, they have their stories. They may not be written down. Well, they might be written down now, but traditionally they would have been passed on by word of mouth, as it were, from one expert storyteller to another. But that story provides the core of who the tribe is, or who the extended community is, and gives it some kind of solidarity. So a lot of our language is based on metaphor. We very rarely say exactly what we mean, right? Our conversations are peppered with allusions and metaphors and stuff, and these often date back to either sort of something like the Bible or Shakespeare, or old folk tales that were widely prevalent within a particular community at some point in the past. And they, if you don't know about those stories, you won't know quite what somebody is meaning when they use
some allusion to I don't know, Little Red Riding Hood or whatever,
right?
In their throwaway, allusion in a conversation, you miss the richness of the conversation exchange. So, and of course, there's loads and loads of cultures around the planet, and all of them have these stories, and all of them are really interesting. So we should all get out there and be as familiar as we can with as many as we have time. But aside from that, what I've come to, well, let me say first of all that I continue to have collaborations with people in the humanities because I still feel I have one foot in the humanities. So I have collaborations with historians on historical topics. I have collaborations with archaeologists on archaeological projects. And I have collaborations with literary people on drama and trying to understand. So they're bringing their humanities perspectives, if you like, and I'm providing a science perspective, and we have a perfect marriage, I hope, in which the two feed off each other and contribute in both directions. So because there's a lot that science can do, and even it turns out a lot of mathematics that can be applied to things in the humanities, which can be very, very illuminating. And we published a paper only a couple of years ago, which was and all my collaborators were mathematicians. Right, there were about 6 of us, I think, on the paper. I was the only non fully signed up qualified mathematician. The others are all mathematicians. It was a structural analysis of Game of Thrones, right? The whole lot, the entire series, right? Of who was interacting with who, scene by scene by scene, right the way through. And one of the things that came out of it was what a masterwork it really was, and the way that the author put this stuff together to keep your interest going over 3 volumes? I mean, 3 enormous volumes. These aren't paper, sort of tiny paperbacks. This is a huge Meisterwerk, as they might say, and it's an amazing construction. The guy must have a brain the size of a planet to have been able to do it.
Yeah.
So there are things.
Takes one to know one too.
There are things that we can learn by applying the science method. And in the end, I've always argued that, things like history and archaeology, or even literature, are sciences. They're trying to explain how the world works in a particular corner of the world. Absolutely. And, what that is about constructing hypotheses and then looking for evidence to test those hypotheses, and then, good if you can find evidence for your hypotheses, even better if you can find they're not quite right because you've left something important out, and you can modify your hypotheses. And so you have the growth of science, as it were. So, I would go for, full integration between the sciences and the humanities. And for that reason, I deeply regret the fact that the humanities are losing some appeal, and particularly languages, because, the richness of human culture in the end lies in the richness of its languages. And however rich English is, and however complex, because it has a huge vocabulary, because it's a mixture of so many different languages, much more so than almost any other language on the planet. Nonetheless, there's still literatures, that are being lost because the languages are being lost.
Well, it's a wonderful kind of a thought that you've shared. And, I think of this show as an investment, despite it being only in English, as an investment in our cultural, resource. We're having conversations about books, and by doing that already, we're in this tiny, small part of the people that, still read and talk about books. And so we're trying to kind of fan the flames a little bit here with the show. And You've touched on a lot of pieces of your research just already, and one thing that you opened up earlier was trust. And I thought, based on all your research, how do humans decide what to trust, and how do you define it? I should add.
It's a bit like defining gravity. If we go back to Dabro's famous books and physics, it's extremely difficult to actually define it because we can't put our finger on it. But, like gravity, we can kind of define what you might think of as an equation that shows how it works, which for scientists is good enough. Scientists are very good, I think, at saying, okay, we don't quite know what this thing really is, but let's start with some rough definition and see how far it gets us. We can improve the definition as we go along and we find out more. But if we don't have a starting point, we won't be prompted to investigate the world itself, and therefore we won't learn anything new, which will cause us to improve our definition. And sadly, a lot of kind of social science and humanities disciplines get tied up in knots over definitions before they're willing to get started. And I think that's a big mistake. What scientists do is just go, well, kind of we know what we mean. We'll have a rough and ready definition, and then we'll improve that and nuance it and refine it as we go along and learn more. But what the definition then does is give you a kind of surgeon's scalpel, which allows you to kind of tease the world apart in very fine detail. So, we're going to do the same here and sort of say trust is some quality of relationship that you and I have as individuals between us, that's to say. So it's very much like gravity between two bodies in the sky, that results in our behavior being changed, so that I can persuade you to behave in a particular way, or vice versa, or we can collaborate on something because there's a sense in which we believe as individuals that the other person isn't going to, in effect, stab us in the back or run off with our money or whatever. And the marker of that is when you look at relationships and you ask people, who've had a relationship breakdown in some form, whether it's with a romantic partner, whether it's with a family member, whether it's with a friend, what caused the rift between you? And very often these rifts are irreparable. If they're close relationships, they're permanent, absolutely catastrophic failure of a relationship. It's almost always trust. One person has done something which has really broken trust. Sometimes it's lots of little breakages along the way which finally add up to enough's enough. You keep letting me down. I keep making these arrangements with you to meet for a beer or a dinner or whatever. And I'm left standing in the rain on the street because you never turn up.
Yeah.
Right? And okay, I forgive you.
Exactly. Or you didn't reply to my text message or whatever.
Exactly. And each of those is probably, not a crisis, but I'm a bit annoyed. But if you keep doing it, eventually I'm just going to say, look, enough's enough. That's it. I'm not making any arrangements with you. You're going to be dropped from my 150. Or they're kind of major crises where somebody has stolen something from the person they have the relationship with. So they've stolen money or belongings or what have you, of some value, emotionally or financially. That has just caused an instantaneous, it is just one step beyond the acceptable. And those cases, these relationships just become irreparable. If it ever repairs, it's a deathbed reconciliation. So that's kind of the issue with trust. It's there. And of course, the whole of our life depends on it because, when you drive a car, even in Canada, despite the fact that there's only one car every mile on the highway, nonetheless, when that car hoves into view, across the mountains, you assume that the other person is going to stay on their side of the road, right, and not drive straight ahead. So all these things, when you get on an airplane to fly somewhere, you assume the captain in the cockpit is going to do the decent job and not attempt to crash land it somewhere. So, it just goes on. And in the end,
crossing at any light, stopping at any sign, anybody in a uniform that's a police officer, everything we do is the food that's not poisonous from the packaging. I mean, Exactly.
Absolutely everything. And this also extends then by definition to science, because science is very, very complicated, and this applies to any form of knowledge, if you like, whether it's theology or it's physics at the two extremes. Because you are not an expert yourself, you might be an expert in, let's say, I don't know, psychology, but you're not an expert in physics because you don't have the training. And therefore, when somebody in physics tells you this will work, you believe that they know what they're doing and you trust them and so on. And, every time you go to the hospital and, they stick you in some dirty, great brain scanner and fire whatever is inside at you, and then show you a picture afterwards of your brain and say, look, there's a lot of it missing, or look, no, it's fine, as circumstances may be, you trust them and you trust the physicists that built the machine and the theory, the physics that it was all based on, because somebody kind of vouches for it and says, yep, I know what I'm talking about, but trust me, I'm a doctor. Of course, sometimes it doesn't work, and then you're kind of disillusioned, and it may colour your whole picture of who these people are. But if we didn't trust people, we wouldn't be living in a society as complex as we are. We'd all be sitting on our own mountains, on our own, probably firing arrows at anybody who tried to come up the mountain, because who knows what they might be climbing the mountain to do to us.
So trust is conducive to collective living.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which improves our quality of life.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, the medical evidence is just crystal clear on this, that the single best predictor of your psychological health and well-being, your physical health and well-being, and even how long you're going to live into the future from today, the single best predictor of that is the number and quality of close friends you have. And that is, everything else that your friendly neighborhood GP worries about on your behalf, like, how many beef burgers do you eat? How much alcohol do you drink? What drugs are you on? How much exercise do you take? You just slob about in front of the television. All these things, they're not insignificant in affecting your health and well-being, but they really are way down the list compared with simply the number and quality of close friendships. It's just extraordinary.
My favorite quote from Friends, Understanding the Power of Our Most Important Relationships, your wonderful book by Little Brown, it's I think in 2020, is on page, very early in the book actually, page 5, you say, "It is not too much of an exaggeration to say that you can eat as much as you like, drink as much alcohol as you want, slob about as much as you fancy, fail to do your exercises, and live in as polluted an atmosphere as you can find, and you will barely notice the difference. But having no friend or not being involved in community activities will dramatically affect how long you live."
Yeah, that's probably going to get me into a lot of trouble with all the local medical folk, but yeah.
No, but your point is very valid. Trust is conducive to a healthy and a healthy well-being society, and the health and well-being of ourselves within that society. And so it plummeting is very, very concerning, and perhaps one of the most problematic issues of our time. I don't know why it's plummeting so bad, or how to get it back.
No, this is the problem, and it's been appreciated for long. I mean, the great problem is, if trust is lost, and we know this happens, and mathematically we and other people have shown it in how networks behave, how banking systems behave. If you lose trust, everything starts to fragment socially into lots of little in-groups. So instead of the whole community or the whole banking system, for example,
or this whole fiat currency or whatever.
Yeah,
it is.
you know,
Nation states.
Yeah, indeed. You know, how do federal nation states like the US and Canada continue to remain together? Why didn't they all split up? You know, the answer is it's the trust between the different components and their ability to cooperate and work together. The moment that trust is lost, that's when these kind of federal systems fragment, or in sort of what look like nation states, sort of homogenous nation states, a single state. There's no such thing. Every state in the world, in Europe and any other part of the world, is a composite of lots of little bits and pieces of local regional groupings who have very different traditions, but who over time history have decided to cooperate together, throw in their lot with each other. So, there are always fraction lines there. There's a massive, great fraction line culturally between the North French and the Southern French. In Germany, which is a much more recently unified, I mean, that's say 19th century, when all the small princely kingdoms in Germany were unified by Bismarck. There are still big differences. The Bavarians are not so enthusiastic about the North Germans. Well, they were Protestants anyway up there. So, you see all these cultural markers that define the different groups, which kind of are damped down to allow groups of people to work together, but they're always at risk of breaking out if trust in the system is lost. So how you solve that problem, that's a big problem. I really am in some despair about this, because I think we have to find a solution to it. Otherwise, we're heading for serious Armageddon. But if you do think of the solution, or anybody out there that's listening comes up with a solution, then I think you will get, and you will certainly deserve, the next Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, part of it, to me, Robin, strikes me as we have just much more information. The internet's accelerated it. This morning, my sister-in-law texted me a video of Russell Brand explaining why we don't need to vaccinate our children for COVID in the next wave. And, Bitcoin is a function of the trust of fiat currency, or the lack of trust in it. And with so much more information and so many different echo chambers, and everybody having their own view of reality based on what their feed tells them, we don't watch the same 3 channels anymore, read the same 3 newspapers.
Yep.
It's just like a constant fragmenting view of reality. You add in AI, you add in psychedelics. Yep. Now we're talking about the complete destabilization of what reality even is. And that's very, very hard to manage for almost any brain.
Yeah, I think you're right in pointing to the fact that the internet hasn't helped, if indeed it hasn't been largely the cause of this fragmentation. But what is clearly happening in all countries around the world, I think, and really especially in the kind of Western world, is this increasing echo chamber phenomenon, because so much of life seems to go on the internet, and on the merit in that sense on the internet is if somebody says something you don't like, you can just pull the plug on them. So you end up with... And
in fact, the algorithm won't give it to you again.
Well, that's right, indeed so. Whereas, and here's the big difference, in the days before the internet, if anybody can remember those, but certainly going back, let's say 100 years to a kind of simpler society, if you like, we lived in villages, and everybody in the village knew each other, right? And they had to know each other because that was their entire world. So everybody went to whatever the community centre of the village was. It might be a pub, it might be, I don't know, a totem pole, it was something in the centre of the village where people gathered. And you had no choice over who gathered, because, you couldn't choose. It's everybody in the village came, and you had to learn to get on with them. And I kind of sometimes describe this by the analogy of children growing up, and playing in the sandpit of life, which is where we learn most of our social skills that are necessary to allow us to manage this hugely complex social world we live in. when you're in the sandpit of life, as kids are, in the sandpit in primary school, when somebody kicks sand in your eyes as they walk past you, you just have to learn to deal with it. You can't say, I'm not going to talk to you again, because that kid never gets out of the sandpit. You can't get out of the sandpit. So you have to learn the skills of diplomacy in how to cope with it. You have to be able to begin with, tell whether they did it deliberately or not. Was it an accident or was it actually deliberate? Because how you respond is very different in those two cases. In the one case, you kind of have to calm down and say, okay, they didn't mean it. I'll forget it. Right? In the other case, you have to decide, well, am I going to beat them up or am I going to talk to them and negotiate some solution? And the answer is, if you try beating them up, the sandpit will fall apart, because nobody's going to get in your sandpit if you're going to be on your own.
You might ask them to borrow their shovel, create reciprocity, and then the trust builds, and whatever it is.
Yes, and what's very important in this context is two major social skills, which we've worked on a lot in the context of both primates but particularly humans. One is the ability to understand what other people are thinking, what's called mentalizing or mind reading. It's the ability to see why they behaved in the way they did. Was it an accident or was it deliberate? And secondly, the capacity to inhibit what psychologists refer to as prepotent responses. That's, say, the capacity to stop the famous marshmallow experiment, which I'm sure many people will remember, the Stanford marshmallow experiment. You have to be able to suppress your selfish desire to help yourself to the biggest slice of cake on the plate in order to ensure that everybody else gets a bit of cake, basically. And if you don't do that, social life is in sizable communities is not going to be possible. Again, you can survive all right on the top of a mountain, but your life is going to be short and less fun.
Well, exactly, and that's why you have to develop the capacity not to punch the kid in the sandbox when you happen to be 10 years old or 20 years old or 30 years old and somebody said something rude to you in a meeting in the office.
Yes.
But that capacity to inhibit prepotent suppressing is certainly like the opposite happens on the internet, when you read the comments or you read the vitriol or you read the right. And then the first part, which I'll say second here, to understand what other people are thinking. Do you have a litmus test on how well we're doing on that one today?
Well, the problem with that is it depends on the size of key bits of well, actually, they both depend on the size of your brain, actually, not only between species, but between individuals. But the mentalizing component really involves a massive, great neural network connecting different parts of the brain, the neocortex in particular. And how well that works. Okay, so if you like, when you're born, your genes provide you with kind of a basic start, a starter kit in terms of the brain. But to get a sort of fully functional adult brain, we have to engage in a huge amount of practice and evaluation of alternative possibilities, as it were, right the way through life. And that process is very, very slow. The current estimates are from developmental psychologists and from our neuroimaging studies that we've done suggest that it takes about the first 25 years of life before you reach adult competencies. And if you don't have those, and if you don't have them in face-to-face experiences, this is the key, then you're not really going to develop the skills to the full extent that we really need them. So the risk is, because if you try and do it online, and if you live your social world entirely online, you're not getting these challenges and experiences and thinking through what's the best way to handle this situation. And there's no substitute for theory. You can't just do it theoretically. You have to do it practically as experience. You may well end up with lower competences, and lower competences means your group sizes are going to be small. Your Dunbar number is not going to be 150, it's going to be 100. And, you're on a kind of one-way downward spiral here into more and more fractionated and kind of echo chambery sorts of worlds. So if we want to try and integrate larger societies, actually what we need is more face-to-face experience, not less. The internet is a wonderful thing, and social media is just amazing in what it can do, but it is, and it genuinely does slow down. I mean, the big problem you have with your friendships and your relationships, even your family relationships, is when you don't see somebody for a long period of time, the quality of that relationship just decays slowly but surely and unavoidably. And it takes about 3 years to shift somebody from, say, your 15 circle. You had a lot to do with that's your main social group, weekend social group. And every time you go out, go out with people from that group of 15 predominantly. To shift somebody from that to no longer being in your 150, but being outside it in the acquaintanceships, that takes about 3 years of not seeing them. So they gradually, your connection with them gradually becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. So, we should try and think of better ways of allowing people to spend time with each other, because that is all it is. It's just literally sitting around the table in the beer garden, talking and doing whatever folks do in those sort of things, eating together, singing together, presumably drinking together, chatting together. All these things are part of the glue that creates friendships, and you are never going to understand, let's say, another culture or another ethnic group if you don't eat with them. You have to sit down and eat with them and live with them, as it were, in that very intimate sense. I'm not even sure just going to school with kids from different cultures is good enough. Yes, you know something about them, but you don't really know much about their home life. It's knowing how they live at home that's critical, and all that is about eating together. So I don't know how you engineer that, sort of having dinner parties for tens of thousands of people is very difficult to engineer.
No, but it seems so puzzling to me that we know this is good for us.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing here, I think, in Britain was that the Eden Project, or a derivative of the Eden Project, famous Eden Project, was to create what became known as the Big Lunch. So once a year, they invite everybody in the country to try and get their street closed off. Well, obviously, if it's a main road, you can't do much about it. But if it's a side street, the local council will close it off for you one Saturday in the year, and everybody puts tables out, trestle tables out, and they all bring their lunch, and they all sit down, and they meet each other, and they share food, from different parts of Britain or different parts of the world, and get to know each other. And I can't think of a better way of doing it. And the studies that have been done on it, we did one study with the Big Lunch Project to do with eating in general, but somebody else did a study of the actual effects on a organization, so an office, on how having, going out to the big lunch and eating together actually benefited the kind of set of relationships within the organization. So people weren't so suspicious of each other from different departments. Sort of the problem that tends to happen otherwise when you get those kind of suspicions and lack of trust building up is you get these kind of silos being created between different departments. So things don't get passed on, which should be passed on, so that your whole organization can function properly. Stuff gets sort of stuck in eddies and lost, and huge inefficiencies come into play as a result. So anyway, there are very good reasons for thinking of ways to do this. And another good way of doing it, again, with all these things are working on the small scale, unfortunately, but we're a species with a big brain, so it just is a matter of thinking through how to do it better. But the other really easy one to do is singing together. So there've been a number of cases where hospitals, for example, and government departments have set up choirs, which have had a magical effect on creating a much more integrated sense of community and commitment within an organisation, within a government department. Particularly, one of the best examples I know of was actually done in South Africa shortly after the end of apartheid. So you now had a government department, particularly the government department that was tasked with integrating society, which consists of two different groups who the week before had been trying to kill each other, basically, right? Because you had the original kind of white civil servants that had been there, who'd been trying to keep apartheid in place, and you had the new black government people coming in whom they'd been trying to suppress. And so you can imagine, the atmosphere was a bit frosty. And then somebody had the idea of creating a choir. I mean, we're not talking about the BBC Philharmonic Choir singing Bach cantatas without even looking at the score, because they you sing it from memory. We're just talking
more
about
like Jingle Bells.
We're just talking about round the campfire, good old round the campfire, singing songs that everybody knows, as it were. And it was just magical, and very quickly, within a year, once they got it going, others wanted to join, and it became a very big deal. They ended up with their own kind of uniform, if you like, and style, and were competing in choral competitions. But the difference it made to how that department worked together was absolutely magical. There's no question about it. So there's a simple solution.
Well, it's great. There are lots of wonderful solutions, and it's not just your research that's echoing this. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy in the U.S., who's a past guest here, has talked about how 1 in 2 American adults he's quoted the same research you have about loneliness being worse for our health than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. We know this to be true. All the positive psychology research, Sonia Lyubomirsky, Daniel Gilbert at Harvard, they all seem to say the same thing. The 1938 Harvard Adult Development Study, connection, community. Everyone says the same thing. This is Then why do we live in, why is detached houses more valuable, and we want to have gated communities, and we want to work from home, and we want to close the company cafeteria? Like, it seems like we're designing our life to be so much more self-oriented, and we know we're sacrificing stuff that makes us happy. Like, why are we doing this?
It's a very good question. I think a lot of it, at least this is certainly my perception, but I know others who've looked at it in much more detail have come to this conclusion. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the fact that we have become less community-minded to a large extent because of two major factors. One is the television, and replaced that more recently with social media, I guess. But and the other is cheap alcohol and cheap food from supermarkets, right? So instead of going out and going to your local community cafe or your local village bar or club or whatever it may be, and having a beer there or a barbecue there with people, who weren't invited. You've just all gone along in order to have a pleasant evening talking to different people and maybe meeting new people who've not been before. But you've not gone just to sit in talking to your specific friend that you went with. That's disappeared, and instead we sit in front of the television with a TV supper and a cheap can of beer. And even though we know that's not good for us, even though after we turn off social media we don't feel good after. Yeah, but I think we don't quite appreciate the consequence, because the problem I think with people in general, and it's part of how we're designed to be, is the issue, is we're not very good at seeing the long-term consequences. What we're very good at is what economists call satisficing. So we don't worry about tomorrow because tomorrow will look after itself. And there's there's a logic to that, because at the end of the day, your problem is just to survive until tomorrow. Right? If you can get through today, we'll deal with tomorrow. And so there is a logic to that. If you like, historically, through our evolutionary history and our recent history, that has kind of worked. As long as you can make sure you got a full stomach and a well-watered and, a roof over your head and a partner in life and all these kind of things, things will work out okay. They don't always, but you can do better than on average, as it were, if you're choosing at random. But I think that problem, this is known as the poacher's dilemma, or in conservation biology, essentially, and it's the same. It reappears in different guises in different disciplines. The problem is you then concentrate on. And I suppose you might say, well, the reason this is we're caused to behave in this way is that evolution has designed us to worry about today. So to make sure your stomach is full and so on, and that you satisfy the immediate requirements of life.
We like the dopamine of the click on on Instagram because it reminds us of finding a fresh raspberry or something.
That's right, yeah. So what you don't sort of worry so much about is then the longer term negative consequences that it comes. So we see this problem all the time. You get it in tribal people when they kind of become part of the larger economies. In Australia was the classic case where, they had a very good native diet, which was, they ate whatever they could get, and a lot of it was very rich, but they didn't get, rich meat, fatty meat all the time. When they got it, they really liked it, and they ate a lot of it, but they were slim, and fit. And the problem is, when people with those kind of diets join the modern economy, where they could go and fill up on cheap food down a takeaway shop down the road, they're just overeating because we have this kind of desire for these certain kinds of foods like fats and so on that are very good from an evolutionary point of view, but once you have too much of them, are very bad because you become obese and all these other diseases of civilization, as they say, like diabetes and coronary diseases and so on, then hit you big time, because you really have to be very disciplined about your eating habits and your drinking habits in order not to fall prey to these kind of natural predispositions is the problem. But, it's hard work, but we can learn. Humans are quite good at learning in general.
Speaking of learning, you were a high school student when you picked up those 2 books on physics, and then we want to move forward a little bit further later in your life when you eventually picked up Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert M. Pirsig. That's Pirsig. This book was originally published in 1974 by William Morrow after being rejected by on a record 121 publishers. I have in front of me the chunky pink 380-page paperback, with a very large, strong, all-caps sort of serif font saying Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Across the top, it says electrifying in all quotes. One of the most profoundly important bestsellers of our time. The fabulous journey of a man in search of himself. There is also a really famous silhouette of a wrench coming out of a flower petals. That famous silhouette's been used on many covers over the years. The title is apparently a play on the 1948 book Zen in the Art of Archery by Eugene Herrigel. File is under 813 for American Fiction. Few things to note about this book before I ask you for your relationship with it, Robin. Number one, Robert Pirsig, interestingly, lived from 1928, born in Minnesota, to 2017, died in Maine. A precocious child with an alleged IQ of 170 at the age of 9, he skipped multiple grades and graduated high school at age 14. In 1943, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and given 2 years of hospitalization and electric shock treatment. This book was written, he says, as a way to cope and deal with the turmoil he, his wife, and his kids experienced from that. The book is a fictionalized autobiography of a 17-day motorcycle journey that Persick made with his 11-year-old son and, for a while, 2 other friends, punctuated by numerous philosophical digressions, all of which serve to introduce his concept of what he calls quality. That's a quoted word, quality, with a capital Q, which he explains as an alternate theory of reality versus the standard subjective, objective reality most of us have been following since the days of Aristotle. And there's a lot to parse through here. Robin, tell us about your relationship with Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert M. Persig.
Okay, so I first came across this book as a graduate student through my PhD supervisor, who was, I'm sure, in a previous existence, probably a Jesuit priest, because he had that kind of austerity to him. But later in life, he became a Zen Buddhist master. Well, the Chinese version of Zen, Chan Buddhism, which is essentially the same as Japanese Zen Buddhism, but the Chinese version. He became a Chan master, and when he died, which was only about less than 10 years ago, I would say, there was an amazing Buddhist funeral for him, in which the monks came down from one Buddhist monastery up in the north of England, came down to the south of England to the funeral to take the funeral. And several monks and a nun from New York flew over to do the chanting. I mean, it was just spectacular. Anyway, wow. He was much into Zen Buddhism from a very early age, because he'd spent time in his earlier life in Hong Kong and discovered Chinese Buddhism through that. And so he was very struck, I think, partly by the title, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. But what I like about this book in particular is you can read it at 2 different levels, right? One is it is literally just a story. And it's a kind of fun story. And this is, as you mentioned, was based on this motorcycle journey he did with his 11-year-old son round various parts. Fictionalized version of, yes. But that was the kind of kickstart for it. So I think they did the journey in sort of the western half of the US, somewhere like that, and towards California side. But yeah, here's this interesting story about sort of long hours on dusty roads, speeding along into the sunset and all that kind of thing, which is in itself kind of makes for quite a good story, and the relationships between the people involved in this journey. But you can also read it at a completely higher plane of existence. And I guess this is where the Zen bit comes into it, because it is deeply philosophical. It investigates or discusses in the process of this some deeply philosophical issues that have been discussed by philosophers since the ancient Greeks. And his term quality is sort of spun off the term qualia, which was introduced into linguistic philosophy by Searle, I think, in the 1960s, late 50s, 60s, an attempt to kind of understand the difference between the world as we perceive it and the world as it actually is. But also, it's a 360 page, or however long it is, defense of the scientific method. And there's this wonderful aside that the hero of the book comes up with in the course of one discussion, which essentially says the scientific method exists to stop us making fools of ourselves, because we can have all sorts of theories about how the world actually works, that we dream up in our shower or our moments of private reflection, which may or may not be accurate. But, when we start to apply them in the real world, the real world has this habit of smacking us one in the face when we've got it wrong. So you come up with your crazy theories and you try to apply them, and if they're not right, you will find out very quickly, because the real world will dump you really hard somewhere uncomfortable for getting it wrong. So I kind of that kind of image has lived with me. I think I used it as an epigraph in one of my books at one stage. It's just such a nice observation. It's basically, it's true. The scientific method works because of it. The close attention to hypothesis testing that does, and its ability to refine and sort of build closer and closer, more accurate theories that has allowed it to succeed. And the evidence that it's successful is all around us. The aeroplanes we fly in. I suppose the one I always cite as the classic example was this absolutely insane idea that the scientists in NASA had of catapulting the Apollo 13 astronauts around the moon. I mean, this was just crazy, but it was all done on the basis of essentially Newtonian physics, Newton's theory of gravity, using the moon as a slingshot. Remember, their kind of spaceship blew up on the way, and all their fuel leaked out, and they only had a tiny bit of fuel in the lander craft, I think. They should have just disappeared and should still be somewhere around, who knows where, beyond the solar system, heading into deeper and deeper space. But no, the guys put their heads together very fast. They didn't have much time to mess about, and came up with the ideas of using the moon as a slingshot and just getting the firing right. And they had to be absolutely precise down to the microsecond, going around the moon to get it to swing round the backside of the moon, and then use the moon's gravitational field as a slingshot to throw the capsule back towards Earth, so that they came back safely. If that isn't a triumph of science, I simply don't know what is, because that was no guarantee that was going to work.
Yeah.
If the theories were wrong, and the theories were wrong by even a few millimeters, they would have been on their way to Alpha Centauri.
Yeah, exactly. The next giant moon or sun in the next galaxy over. It's interesting that you use that. There's two levels of reading it, because the 2007 New York Times obituary of Pirsig actually says, in seeking to reconcile humanism with technological progress, the book was perfectly timed for a generation weary of the 60s revolt against soulless high-tech worlds dominated by corporate and military industrial orders. And I kind of wondered if we've come back the other way now.
Well, I don't know. I think we're still in that world. That's the problem. But you do have to remember that it was written off the back of the kind of hippie 60s era, as it were, and culture, and was
slingshotted off of that idea.
Very much embedded in that. This is this sort of Easy Rider sort of story, if you like. But also had that sense of, part of that 60s culture was also very reflective, and of course got deeply embroiled in Eastern mysticism and Eastern philosophy and the like, and became somewhat philosophical, rather naively so probably in reality, but did reflect on the meaning of life and why the world worked the way it does. And this is what that book is. And it's interesting. I mean, it's kind of interesting, the whole background to this, the fact that he had schizophrenia, or at least was, sort of treated for schizophrenia earlier in his life, because very often people who are highly creative have had exactly those kinds of problems early in life. It seems to give them something, a different way of looking at the world, which is, allows them to produce these very rich, imaginative stories. And we go back to storytelling that I talked about earlier, being the central part of our culture. He never is one of those classic cases where he then produced nothing for decades and then produced one more book, Lila, at the end of it all, which was much more about romantic relationships, this relationship the hero of the book has with this woman, Lila. And that also seems to be extremely common great writers come in two kinds. They churn stuff out. Shakespeare, Dickens, you can think of many examples. But then there's this other little group who produce very few major works, but everything they do is absolutely spot on and brilliant. So Persig was in the first category, very much in the first category.
The most popular quote from this entire book, because you can go on Goodreads and they rank the quotes. The most popular quote from this entire book is, "When one person suffers from a delusion, it is called insanity. When many people suffer from a delusion, it is called religion."
Yes.
You wrote your most recent book, which I'm holding up now for those that might be watching us, is How Religion Evolved and Why It Endures, a wonderful Pelican book that I've really been enjoying flipping through. I'm curious if you ascribe to a particular doctrine yourself, how you think about religion, and if you can just paint that answer to the question that the book proposes. Yes, how did religion evolve? Why does it endure today?
This is that new book of mine is just a sort of homage to Persig for exactly the reason you mentioned in that quote from the book. Yeah, I mean, it came about. I mean, I guess I've always been interested in religion to some extent. I mean, most of us are brought up in some sort of religious context or religious schools or families or what have you, so we all have that kind of experience, and then we lose the interest in it or at some point later in life, teenagers very often. But nonetheless, I retained an interest in religion because, and particularly so when we were working on what creates communities, how we create communities through the mechanisms that are involved in friendship. And it became more and more obvious to me that one of the mechanisms that had played a very important role historically, and I suppose still does, has been religion, particularly the rituals of religion rather than the beliefs. But the beliefs are part of that sort of multi-legged stool that allows us to identify members of our community. That's our worldview. Religion and morality, our moral views, are one of those legs. And so
the seven pillars of
friendship. Yes, exactly. So eventually, only about 5 years ago, I got having sort of dabbled a little bit in religion, and I guess actually the reason that this remained an interest of mine rather than being sort of just offloaded completely was the fact that I grew up in East Africa, where I was deeply, deeply embedded in many different cultures. And that was partly because my father was born and grew up in India. He didn't leave India till he was in his 20s. So he was, bilingual in Hindi, and he, moved very easily in different Indian social circles. East Africa was full of every...
my mom was born in Nairobi.
Okay, there you go. I lived next door in the next country in Tanganyika, in the north of Tanganyika. So Nairobi wasn't that far away. I knew from a very, very early age, because we mixed with all these communities, the differences between Sikhs and Parsis and Ismaili communities and the Gujarati communities and all these Indian communities, and they're different religions. It was kind of just part of the culture. And then because we were in East Africa, I grew up speaking Swahili. I was bilingual in Swahili, and therefore I knew the different sort of tribal religions that you had that we bumped up against and locally, but also, of course, the Swahilis being highly Arabized were Sunni Muslims. So I had, Shia Muslims from India, northwest India, and Sunni Muslims from the Arab world. So I knew the difference between these two major branches, and then of course, as a result of my parents weren't particularly religious, but they came from Presbyterian backgrounds. My grandparents were, on my father's side anyway, Presbyterian missionaries. So I was introduced to Presbyterian Christianity, but I went to a Catholic prep school, primary school, up to the age of 13. So I was deeply immersed in that. Then I went to boarding school in England at an Anglican environment. So I had all these religious influences, and I sat in. And my cousin was deeply into Zen Buddhism, and through him I got introduced much more to the kind of Asian kind of Hinduism, Buddhism framework, as it were, as opposed to all the other subcontinent religions from India. Because we didn't really have many. I discovered only earlier this year that a lot of the guys I knew were Jains. I had no idea that they were Jains, actually. I kept going through life complaining that the one religion from India I'd never really met somebody of. And then I discovered from somebody who was from Nairobi, or at least their parents were from Nairobi, oh yeah, we're Jains, well, what's your surname? Shah. What? The Shah boys? I knew the Shah boys. But they just kept very quiet and they never brandished their religion about it, I guess. So anyway, I was deeply immersed in these cultural differences and on a daily basis, and particularly the religions that they all engaged in. And so it was, that was always interesting to me, people's tribal origins, if you like, because that colours their way of life. And I'd grown up doing anthropology as you should do it. That's living, growing up with the people, not sort of being going out in your 20s or 30s and not being able to speak the language properly and all these kind of things. So anyway, that played a very, very important role, I think. But this book then came out of the project we did when I was finally persuaded, no, we really need to do a proper study of the role of religion in creating communities and its evolution, as it were, and that triggered this book. So it was kind of, I was very nervous about doing it because I was kind of thinking I might be fatwad, but so far not yet.
But what is the, if I read correctly, and I was reading National Geographic, so, but they had reported that Canada, US, England, Australia, New Zealand, France, these countries are tipping over into secular majorities. And in fact, yes, most of the world these days is this is happening. And they say millennials are the least religious demographic we've ever seen and below. So what is the story of religion in the world today, and how do you see it changing?
This is a very good point. I mean, the problem is, I suppose, whether you view religion as a good thing or a bad thing. I'm bearing in mind Pirsig's observation that religion is just a collective form of delusion, and you can argue perfectly sensibly that is the case. It is about belief and trust. It's about something we can't actually physically put our finger on and say, look, let's stick God into the brain scanner and see what happens. People have to believe that the spirit world exists, as it were. Otherwise, you don't have religion, and that's a judgment that everybody makes. And religion always dies during times of peace. There's a lot of evidence from big cross country studies now that have been carried out, and that religion always revives in times of war or civil war, because people need something to hang on to, essentially, is what seems to happen. So if you've had a prolonged period of peace, which certainly all these countries in the West, and the ones you mentioned in particular, we've had 70 years of peace. There have been wars going on in different parts of the world, but they haven't, sort of expanded to affect us.
None of my friends got drafted.
No, exactly. There was the Vietnam War as a little blip in the middle, but, still, the number of people, the amount that actually affected how life was lived in anywhere in the West was minimal. Okay, large numbers of kids got drafted to go out there in the US in particular, less so other countries, and large numbers of them got killed and stuff. But by and large, the effect that it had, was probably bigger for the anti-war protests and the protest songs that were written, for the actual real effect that a small war in one country on the far side of the world actually created. So anyway, here we are as a result. I think very much that belief in religion is disappearing. Now, you might say, along with Richard Dawkins, that's a good thing, because people don't behave in ways that are driven by delusions, or people who are, want to promote delusions for their own benefit, which is his kind of view of priests, I think. And of course, that's true. Religion has been, and still is, for goodness sakes, the cause of probably more wars than anything else, any political views, that's for sure, historically. But on the other hand, you have to balance that against the fact that religion has played a very prominent role in maintaining social cohesion within groups, within communities. And if only because the fact that everybody has to go to church on Sunday, or to mosque on Friday, or whatever, synagogue on Saturday, and meet the rest of the community. And maybe, if you think of Sikh services, they'll have a communal meal afterwards. All these things, they're engaging with each other. That's right. And engaging with each other and negotiating how to behave communally, and negotiating communal projects, maybe of some kind, maybe charities or something like that, charitable works. All these things are highly beneficial, and the fact that you are engaging with people has these huge knock-on consequences for your psychological and physical health and well-being. So if you're losing that,
right,
you're losing something which is massively beneficial. And of course, we all the rest of us end up paying for this, because there's a much bigger drain on the health services, the social security process, and all these kind of things. So it's all doom and gloom. But as Pirsig might have said, there's no such thing as a free lunch in biology or life. In other words, in biology and life, there's always a benefit and a cost to everything, right? So it is with religion. Even if it's wrong, it clearly has benefits, right? And the question you have to ask is, do the benefits at the level of the individual and community outweigh the costs that are incurred in promoting and prosecuting a religion in that kind of way? And that's the judgment we have to make. The question is, can you replace religion with something which is not religious in the conventional sense? So it doesn't believe in gods and angels and all these other kinds of things. In other words, can you have a secular religion? And I talk about this at the end of the book. And I think the answer is no. There is something very peculiar about the spirit world, as it were, that is very, very engaging. This is why religion keeps resurfacing. Whenever nation states, the government has tried to repress religion, and there have been quite a few historical examples of this, in recent centuries, religion has always bounced back. People have a need for it. So you kind of go, well,
why is that?
Well, I think it goes back to the fact that it was probably Freud who proposed this particular reason for the existence of religion, and that is the comfort hypothesis, essentially. That
we don't know why we're here.
Yeah, well, it's much more than that. It's that the world we live in is so awful. It's constantly throwing googlies at us. A term from cricket, obviously. That's, say, an unplayable ball. About which Canada is doing much better these days, I hasten to say, but still not in the quality of Canadian ice hockey.
That's the long-term benefits of all the immigration we've had. See,
yes,
got a lot of
indeed. So
even our soccer team, when they show our soccer team, it's like 85% of the Canadian men's soccer team is born elsewhere. You know what I mean, or some very high number. I'm making it up, but it's like we've figured out how to bring all the good athletes in.
Yeah. Anyway.
And export some of our hockey players to Europe.
Yeah. Indeed. So bankers, especially. Yes. If you remember, the previous head of the Bank of England was from Canada.
Yes, that's right.
We always borrow from Canada if we need somebody to sort our problems out. Anyway,
I love that.
Anyway, the problem is the world is so full of unpredictable things. Famines,
there we go.
Whatever.
So full of unpredictability.
That something that gives us hope that for the future, or hope to be able to control the future, just seems to be psychologically something we grasp at. And you see it in kind of things. People still do all these things like throwing money into wishing wells and hanging up prayer requests on at wells associated with spirits or saints or what have you, or banyan trees if it was India, sort of go and leave your wishes so that the gods sort things out in your life, and illnesses, and the search for love and the search for children if you're infertile, and all these things that are part of the kind of terrors of everyday life, I suppose you might think of them. Religion gives you comfort and holds out the promise that things will be okay, that somebody who has control over the world is actually on your side and going to sort it out for you, because it's absolutely beyond you or anybody else on earth. So I think that's part of this problem, that when things get tough, you start to look to the spirit world, and you see it in all these kind of terrible events that happen around the world as are happening now. When people's lives are threatened, you think you're going to die. The number of people that said, I said a prayer. I haven't said a prayer for 40 years, but in that moment, I said a prayer, and as it happened, I survived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot there, and that could be a whole other separate 2-hour conversation. But we will leave people with how religion evolved and why it endures. Your book. I was just before I go to the next question, how do you describe? I'm just curious because you're so articulate. How do you describe your personal belief system?
Oh, I'm just a jobbing biologist, evolutionary biologist. That's all. I mean, if I was religious, I would be a Buddhist. Buddhism is all about self-help, right? Nirvana is where to aspire to, but there is no, Buddhism, like many religions, recognizes that we're not all capable of traveling this road on our own, and makes concessions to weaker brethren, as you might say, by allowing them the rituals and so on, and doing good works and giving food to the monks and nuns of the community and all these kind of things. But at the end of the day, its bottom line is, and of course Zen Buddhism is the kind of ultimate ascetic version of this. It's all on your head. You've got to sort it out. There are practices which you can do to help you on your way, which our predecessors have developed and refined. But in the end, you have to figure it out, and you have to. You're responsible for your good deeds and your bad deeds. And if too many bad deeds, well, you're going to have to do the lesson all over again in the next life. I'm not sure about whether that's really true, but the reality is, it's all about behaving well as a member of a wider community, and essentially that's what it's teaching. And it's you look at any of the great religions of India, for example. They all say essentially the same thing. They may disagree about the theology, but the objectives are essentially the same. It's all about creating a better community.
Chapter 75 of this show with George Saunders, author of Lincoln in the Bardo and other books, we went deeper into Buddhism because he identifies as a Buddhist. So for those listening who want to go deeper, check out Chapter 75. I did want to ask you about raising boys because, of course, this book is about a 17-day autobiographical, fictionalized road trip with his 11-year-old son, Chris. It made me think about boys and raising boys particularly. I have 4 boys under 9 today, but on the Modern Wisdom podcast, which, by the way, you did 2 wonderful conversations with Chris on Modern Wisdom podcast. I'd recommend people check both of those out, as well as your conversation with Ali Ward on ologies, which is, Ali's been on this show. We love Ali here. And you said, we see men climbing stupidly high cliffs, playing vigorously brutal games, all displays of just watch me, I can afford to take these risks because my genes are so good. You even shared the results of a study you did, which found, I believe, that men jaywalk at a higher rate when women are watching.
Yes.
So the question I have, thinking motorcycle trip with your son, but also your own research and my personal situation, how do you safely raise boys when they have such a higher than normal incidence of dying in these adolescent years? What is this? What do we do about this? Is it simply stand back and watch, or what do we do?
Let's make it more general. Just going wrong. Yes, they have a much higher risk of getting into dangerous situations and killing themselves effectively, but also they have a much higher risk of just going down the wrong track and ending up with the wrong people and wrong friends, if you like, and coming off the rails and maybe not killing themselves, but doing enormous harm to other people, or just ending up in jail rather than being able to be a contributing member of society. Yes, boys are tricky. I'm always very worried about giving advice on anything like this, because I kind of think there are far too many books of advice on child rearing, and probably for the best thing you can do is throw them in the trash can and just relax and take life as it comes, because essentially we're designed by evolution to do these things. Every context is different. No 2 children are the same in the way they develop, and just having a book which says you must always do this or you must always do that might work for a proportion of cases, but is not going to work in others, and is going to get you in trouble. You're much better off kind of just going with the flow. Some people are going to do that better than others, that's for sure. That's unfortunate. But part of the reason for doing that is that many of the things that are crucial for the social world we live in, so behavior, if we understand too much about what's going on and try to think through consciously what we're doing, we just mess it up. And a classic example of this, which I used to do with students, particularly first year freshman students, when I was teaching them general kind of ethology, is a lovely study done many years ago of what happens when you greet somebody in the street. And there's a series of things you do. You flash the eyebrows, you smile, you look away, catch their eye, you look away, and there's a set sequence in which you do these. right? And if you know that you have what you have to do, you always get it wrong. If you just forget all that and go into greeting somebody in the street without any preconceptions, you always get it right. So it's a bit like that with rearing children. It's not to say
sounds a little bit like trust in a way.
yes, I think so. But I think
it's
also
so close you can't see it anymore.
I think trust is also part of the game here, because it's about developing a level of trust with your children that you can talk them through situations, because actually, there is a sense in which you can talk them through why they should or shouldn't do things. There's a difference between boys and girls and how they respond to this, undoubtedly. I'm not sure that girls are any easier. They're just different problems that you get, as you very quickly learn if you have some of each. Boys undoubtedly don't, by and large, think in an emotional sort of way about things. They can get upset, but they're not really thinking about the emotional quality of relationships in the way that girls do. And that, in some sense, is why their world is much more kind of physical games kind of based, but by and large. But there are differences even within boys where they lie on a kind of boyish spectrum. So I think you just have to, it's luck if you get to the end of it all and they turn out to be good citizens. You can pat yourself on the back, but you also need to breathe a sigh of relief that you escaped from some seriously risky situations. In other words, by luck, your kids never got in with the wrong group of friends who went off the rails. They never became Billy the Kid, bad boys.
They do have a tendency, though, as you said in your research, to show off their gene strength.
Yes. Yeah, this is a particular problem in teenage boys, and of course, this is why teenage boys are get heavily into sport, right? Because it's physical, physically they enjoy it. It's good for them. It's exercise. And it's social exercise in most cases. They're team sports, so you learn. You're learning life skills here. But there is a sense in which it's also practice and for performance in front of the girls, when the girls eventually turn up and in life, as it were, and stand on the sidelines. And the mating game has a lot to answer for, I'm afraid. Yeah.
In the 1950s and 60s, Robert Pirsig taught rhetoric. He was a professor of rhetoric at Montana State College, and he did a Native American church peyote ceremony, which he says he had a mushroom cloud of thought from this experience, and he developed his ideas for this book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I was curious, based on all your research, what role drugs or psychedelics in particular have had on humanity and culture historically, and with the sort of psychedelic boom that we seem to be in, what role do you see them playing? Like, what's happening exactly with our relationship of altering our consciousness?
That phenomenon has been with us since before history. There's no question. We have archaeological evidence of that, both in the old world and in the new world. Dating back in the old world, sort of long before anybody found their way to North America. It's one of those things. I think that's also part and parcel of the. This is what I call the mystical stance. This in the book. It's this mystical stance, this sense of the unknowable that you encounter inside your mind through the practices of religion, that creates the attractiveness of it all, as it were. There's this sense that you can be in the mind of God, the ineffable, as it were, that is consistent in all religions. Every major religion, every minor religion, if it comes to that, has this mystical tradition to it. Very often the hierarchy disapproves of it because it tends to be a bit anarchic and is the cause of heretical beliefs. But this sense of being able to be part of the mind of God, which is, I suppose, in Buddhism is nirvana. That is what nirvana is ultimately. But you can experience these same things in trance states in all the religions. And, sort of, if you think of both Islam and Sikhism, the recitation of the names of God and so on, are designed to induce this trance state, this sense of enormous calmness and the feeling that you are outside your body and integrating with the spirit, the great spirit, as it were. And of course that gets carried on into these kind of traditions, like you have in Islam with the Sufi tradition, where both the dancing, as in the kind of Mevlavi sect in Turkey, the whirling dervishes as they were known, but also Qawwali singing in the Shia tradition that's very common in sort of through from Iran through to the northwest of India. There's Qawwali singing very often in Persian or in Urdu. These beautiful poems, but the singing is designed to ramp you up into a state of trance and give you this experience, direct experience of the mind of God. So this plays a very important, and I think it's very, very ancient. It dates back to when we were kind of living in caves 100,000 years ago, was when we first discovered it, probably. So that component seems to be underpinned, as we understand it now, underpinned by a very intense trigger of the endorphin system in the brain. So the endorphin system in the brain is part of the pain control system. It's an opiate, very similar to morphine chemically, but we don't get addicted to it.
Endogenous morphine.
Yeah, the name comes from endogenous morphine, the body's own morphine, endorphins. But the endorphin system underpins the trust and sense of warmth we have that creates friendships and, by extension, membership of a community. But if you really get the system going, and many of the ways of inducing trance are very, very brute force. So a lot of physical stress and exercise and cold and overheating and singing and dancing very vigorously, will trigger the system. But and that's widely used in all over the world in many of the religions, primitive and the sort of modern world religions. But it seems that we can mimic these effects chemically very easily. And lots of cultures have discovered this, both in South and Central America historically and North America, the native folk, but also all over the old world, through various of these mind-bending drugs that occur naturally in nature. Opium, marijuana, etc., magic mushrooms, whatever. And they certainly enhance religious feeling. There's a very famous experiment done at Harvard by the Divinity School, the theological faculty there, on one of the campus churches, where they gave a bunch of theology students that they were training to the Christian priesthood for one big, I think it was at Easter, so a major feast of the year, as it were, and the kids who went through that experience said they never, although most of them did go on to be, priests and what have you in as careers, they said they never had such an intense religious experience ever again in their life as they had in that one weekend experience with, I think they were being given magic mushrooms or something, if I remember rightly.
Or LSD, maybe. Well,
Yeah,
I just thinking Harvard.
Was it? Well,
LSD.
yes, probably. They just invented it, haven't they?
Just thinking of the Timothy Leary.
So, there is something about this sense of engaging with the divine mind directly in a way which we can't do. Indeed, we can't do with each other. We kind of do our best to get inside each other's minds in our close relationships. But at the end of the day, we're kind of relying on cues, the way you speak, whether you're crying or, the grimaces you make in your face, and whether you're laughing, all these kind of things, and we interpret them as a kind of avatar, right. My sense of you, as let's say my friend, is really I'm having a conversation with an avatar in my head all the time,
right?
And sometimes we just get it completely wrong, and the whole thing falls apart. And sometimes we do it better, and the relationship kind of lasts a lifetime. We grew up together at school, and we're still meeting up once a year, maybe, or whatever. In our 90s. And so this sort of the difference between that sense of struggling to understand how your best friend or romantic partner or whoever is thinking and feeling is, sort of leagues away from this sense you get of being able to enter into the mind of God, or what appears to be the mind of God in some form. In the context of trance, it's hugely engaging and hugely appealing. And, most religions endeavor to kind of create the environment in which that can happen for you. But as I said, they're often very nervous. At least the Abrahamic religions appear to be very nervous. They don't really like this mystical stuff because it's kind of very anarchic. If you've entered into the mind of God, you believe whatever you believe, and you can't be persuaded different. And if the Pope wags his finger at you, or the chief mullah wags his finger at you and says, no, that's not what it says in the Bible or the Quran, you go, but I've had direct experience of the mind of God. I know. And so it leads to this anarchic consequences of sex kind of bubbling up from underneath and kind of either breaking away, or disappearing eventually because they're so weird and cranky. But all the big religions originally started as sex out of some other one. It's the end of the day. So, and nearly always as a result of somebody having these kind of experiences and believing they've seen the true truth.
Well, this is why the true truth. That's interesting. That's a wonderful phrase. The true from Cloud Atlas. We had David Mitchell on in chapter 58. I still remember that scene in the movie. So yeah, you've helped justify and explain why there is an increased with access and the information of the internet. Why people are more and more interested, it seems, in having experiences like that to be able to see and perceive and feel more self-aware or more connected in that mystical stance that you described.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. We got another book still. I'm just loving this conversation, and we're going deep down we're going deep down rabbit holes. I just have become so familiar with how much you have researched, and so it's so tempting for me to ask for your opinion or your perspective on so many topics, but we haven't even hit the 1954 radio play by Dylan Thomas that premiered on the BBC and was published in a book the same year by J.M. Denton Sons. I am, of course, talking about Under Milk Wood. It's a black and white cover. I've got it right here in front of me. I found this thing completely entrancing. Entirely black background with a sort of primary construction paper style shapes on this front. A lowercase italicized Under Milkwood on the left going upwards. A lowercase italicized Dylan Thomas on the right side going downward. Dylan Thomas famously was born in Swansea, Wales, in 1914, and it was reported to have died of drink at age 39 in Greenwich Village, New York. Later, that was revealed to be, upon studying what happened, the pneumonia at age 39. He's a poet and writer characterized by rich, vivid language and passionate, complex themes. Perhaps most famous for, in addition to this wonderful radio play turned book, his poem, Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light, which may be a phrase people are familiar with. Under Milkwood was the BBC radio play for voices, finished just before his death in 1953, performed over the years by people as interesting as Anthony Hopkins, Richard Burton, Elton John, Elizabeth Taylor, Peter O'Toole, and many others. It's a full expression of the magnificent flavor and variety of life, a moving and hilarious account of a spring day in a small Welsh town. Robin, tell us about your relationship with Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas.
So this is really emerged out of the fact that being a child of the humanities, at high school I studied English and history. They were my two main things. So poetry was a major feature of my life. I wrote a lot of poetry. I even wrote poetry in Swahili, as well as English. And so, I've always had this love of poetry. And poetry is kind of interesting because it is very unspecific. In other words, you can read a poem. The best poems are the ones you can read in many different ways. So no matter who you are, you can interpret it in a way that is meaningful to you. And that's a kind of magical thing to be able to do. And also, it's, the other thing about poetry is this capacity that poets have, good poets, let's say, have to put into words our emotional states. We're not very good at doing that, and especially boys are not very good at doing that. And it, is why, sort of American teenagers are very famous for saying, trying to describe something and then adding the ending, you know what I mean, because actually it's impossible to describe these inner feelings. For most of us in words, but somehow poets have this gift for being able to do so. So I've always liked poetry, and then I came across Dylan Thomas surprisingly quite late in life, probably really in my 40s before I actually read any of his poetry, and in particular Under Milkwood. And I first came across it as the original radio version because they recorded it. It was Richard Burton was one of the narrators. It has two narrators talking you through this one day in the life of 24 hours in the life of a village. And I came across a CD of it it's a 2 CD set at a concert, a classical concert. And so bought it and went, I should listen to this. It's very famous. I've never read it. And I was just captivated by it because the Welsh are very good with words in the way the Irish also are. Produce lots of literary geniuses. And Dylan Thomas has that capacity to use words with slightly different meanings. If you like, it's using a word in the wrong place. So it gives you a slightly different nuance on it. And in fact, this is the key to English as a language, because what most native English speakers don't realise, well, let's start at the bottom. English has a huge vocabulary, right? The current estimate has a vocabulary of 800,000 words. Now, most of these words are actually foreign from different languages. French, by comparison, has a vocabulary of 60,000 words. Now, 60,000 words is about the typical vocabulary that any one person can use. I mean, let's say, a well-educated person will have a vocabulary of about 60,000 words. They won't use all those words in everyday speech, but they know what they mean and they know how to use them and they can read them and so on. So every living Frenchman knows every word in the French language, but every living English speaker around the world only knows about a tenth of the words in the language. And part of this is a consequence of the fact that English itself is a Creole. It's a mixture of principally Anglo-Saxon, obviously, It's the Germanic language, and French come from the Normans, onto which was being grafted a lot of Norse words from the Vikings turning up in between those two. And then so it started, I think, with an advantage of being a mixture of languages in a way which made the language very rich. And then it was kind of made even richer by the empire, because English then had this capacity to borrow words from anywhere that was interesting. So a lot of words in everyday English, which are Hindi, which people don't realise. Shampoo, loot.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, shampoo, pajamas. Almost all the words we use for different kinds of materials are Hindi in origin. There's a huge number of words, like bungalow, you name it. People just don't even realise that actually they're talking Hindi. But also, and again, from Gaelic and from Scotland, from Lowland Scots.
We borrow from everywhere. Karaoke is Japanese.
Yes. I mean, unlike French, which tries to prevent you borrowing and sort of diluting the language, English for some reason has been very, very kind of outward going, and I don't mind where the word comes from if it sounds good and does the job, right? Now, one of the consequences of that, we then end up with, and I think we give one example of this in our book, we have the languages we use for the stuff we put on at night, pajamas, let's say, which obviously is Hindi. There are 8 different groups of words that come from 8 different languages that we use in everyday language. So, but the key one, which I really love, is, so English essentially is built around a mixture of a Germanic language, Anglo-Saxon, and Norman French, a French word. Now, as a result of that, for every single thing you want to think about, we have a German word and a French word. Now, the German word is always short and blunt. And the French word is kind of musical and multisyllabic and sounds very happy and courteous and stuff. So without even thinking about it, native English speakers, if they want to be rude to somebody, use the German version of the word. And if they want to be polite and effusive and courteous, they use the French word for the same thing. And we just do it. Can you
give us an example?
Even, I keep getting asked this question and my mind goes blank.
No, it's okay. But you this is still very healthy, interesting background on the English language, which Dylan Thomas is using an incredible way.
He was particularly skilled, I think, at being able to do that. And secondarily, written on top of that, was this very brilliant ability he had of being able to study people and get inside their minds and see why they were behaving. So if you look at Under Meltwood, he basically describes everybody in the village, or at least all the main people, plus lots of sort of characters who stand for groups of other people, where there are many more of them, the ordinary working men and women. And it is his observations are so acute. I mean, it is absolutely amazing to particularly to listen to it. You really want to hear it read with all the different voices, and you can see in there people you know from your everyday life, and you kind of go, oh, there's Auntie so-and-so, there's old Jim from down the road. It is absolutely staggering, and that's a good, it's the traits of a good novelist. It's like reading Jane Austen. She was such a good observer of the foibles of everyday life, and the things that make people tick, and the stupidities of how they tick in some cases. So for me, that's kind of ethnography. It's the study of human behavior in nature, done in such close detail. It's the beginnings of science, because after that, to do science, you need to know enough about the world to see the regularities, and here are the regularities just beautifully sketched out in this beautifully poetic language. by Dylan Thomas, and it's the beginnings. As I kind of see the way science works, it's the sort of first stage of science, because you have to see those kind of commonalities and regularities that allow you to describe the world in this fine detail.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because this, if for anyone that's read Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, it has a similar, like, disorienting, you read the first few pages and you're like, what is going on? I mean, page 17, 3 characters named Mr. Ogmore, Mr. Pritchard, and Mrs. Ogmore Pritchard, okay, have this dialogue. This is 1 page of text, or what, 1.5 pages. I'm just going to read it for people, get a sense of this, what we're talking about. Mr. Ogmore, I must blow my nose. Mrs. Ogmore Pritchard, in the garden, if you please. Mr. Ogmore, in a piece of tissue paper which I afterwards burn. Mr. Pritchard, I must take my salts, which are nature's friend. Mr. Ogmore, I must boil the drinking water, because of germs. Mr. Pritchard, I must take my herb tea, which is free from tannin. Mr. Ogmore, and have a charcoal biscuit, which is good for me. Mr. Pritchard, I may smoke 1 pipe of asthma mixture. Mrs. Ogmore Pritchard, in the woodshed, if you please. Mr. Pritchard, and dust the parlor, and spray the canary. Mr. Ogmore, I must put on rubber gloves, and search the peak for fleas. Mr. Pritchard, I must dust the blinds, and then I must raise them. Mrs. Ogmore Pritchard, and before you let the sun in, mind it wipes its shoes.
That is such a brilliant line that finishes that. You have to remember, this is Mrs. The lady, Mrs. Ogmore Pritchard, is a widow, and very precise. And I'm sure lots of these sort of people who their houses are beautifully polished and everything is in its place and so on. And she was married to 2 men, right, in succession, and she clearly terrorized them, basically. So this scene is going on in Mrs. Ogmore Pritchard's mind as she's waking up in the morning, and her spirits of her 2 husbands are lying either side of her, engaged in this conversation with her. But there is another similar kind of thing with the sea captain, who, as he's waking up in the morning, because the thing starts at sort of 6 o'clock in the morning, the story starts at 6 o'clock in the morning as the village starts to come to life. And he's waking up and he's half dreaming, and all these voices from his past and their various deaths engaged, with him in his mind, sort of skulls talking on the seabed of people who drowned, and the one that always amuses me is I forget the name, because they say, oh, this is so and so, the sea lawyer that worked with you. This is so and so, the donkey man on the donkey engine that worked with you on the ship. And it says, Jim died slipped to his death in Nantucket or something like that, because he was drunk and he'd been out on the town with the ladies. Very enjoyable. These little phrases that are just thrown into the middle that cap it all. That
before you let the sun in, mind it wipes its shoes.
Yes, and you can just see her, and you know exactly who that person is because you've met somebody exactly like that. So the whole thing is this very, very everyday picture of individuals who are universal. They're there in all cultures. They're there in all societies. We all know them from our personal lives, but it's just wonderful stuff.
They're there in all cultures. They're there in all societies. This book is an introduction to ethnography in some sense. Yep. And you've studied ethnography, demography, if I've said out the right, cultures and civilizations, how they move through time. I wondered if I could get your perspective on what's happening today globally with fertility, birth rates, how you see that long-term trend shaping, and what you think. Many prominent people have said this is, now even on the cover of the newspaper today, you've got the leader of China, telling women to spend more time at home and have more babies. Elon Musk is saying that the decline of the human population in 2050 is the biggest risk for our time. How do you, with your wider view of human civilizations, regard the current, issue, and putting in quotation marks, with fertility and birth rates globally? And what does this signify? What does this mean?
Well, the problem is it's a very complicated issue because there are so many strands to it. As always, nothing in life is simple. One aspect of it has to be that there are just too many of us, I'm afraid. We're overloading the planet. And we just, there's a sense in which we cannot go on like this. We have to somehow reduce the populations. It's going to end up very badly otherwise. And the problem is that's slightly in conflict with the well understood thing that, your industries and your software industries and your hardware industries and all those kind of things depend on having workforces. So, immigrants or immigration has always been good for countries and historically because it's provided a workforce at the time, the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, whatever, that has allowed countries to develop and grow economically. So you kind of go, oh dear, we need lots of people to provide the workforce, but on the other hand, there is a limit. We just cannot continue producing the number of people we have. So that's kind of one problem on the side, which somehow we have to grapple with. The Chinese tried to grapple with it. It came badly unstuck, and so this is the one-child policy. The effect of that was everybody very carefully ensured they had sons because that helps to carry on the family name and stuff. You don't always have to have sons, but it just so happened that in their culture that's what happened. That's certainly what's happened in a number of other places. Some people prefer daughters, but usually the circumstances for that are different. However, they ended up with this huge number, and we're talking about millions, tens of millions of excess males. Well, excess males with no wives is trouble, serious trouble. And in the end, they ended up importing wives from the Philippines. And
why is excess males with no wives serious trouble? What's that? The historical ramification you're talking about, just to enlighten us.
Well, it has been so through time, right? But they are just a nuisance. If you want to keep males well behaved, the best way to do it is to provide them with a wife, if you want to put it that way. In other words, that the society is arranged so that they can find themselves a wife in some way. Cases where that hasn't happened just creates problems. So the other classic example is has been argued quite cogently as the reason why the Portuguese first started exploring the world. So the beginning of European expansion in the sort of 15th century. And that was that after the Moors had been thrown out of the Iberian Peninsula by the Spanish and Portuguese between them, the nobility, such as they were, from each country, basically had a freebie on all these big estates that had been previously owned by the Moorish Arab colonists, I suppose you might call them. And this was fine because this was great for the ducal families, the nobility. They acquired these big estates. When their sons grew up, they could split the estates between them, so they each got a big share. Which made them very attractive as marriage partners to the daughters of other families. But there came a point where they ran out of land, and they into this really bad economic position where if you keep partitioning the land, you end up with holdings which are too small to be economically viable. At this point, Portugal in particular switched from equal inheritance, as had been the case prior to that, into primogeniture, so the oldest son inherits everything. And then you've got a bunch of younger sons who get nothing and are pretty grumpy about it. So what they end up doing is they end up basically riding motorbikes, very big motorbikes, around the villages on late Saturday night, drunk, being a nuisance. So to solve that problem, essentially the Portuguese monarchy said, listen guys, why don't you go abroad and do something useful? Go exploring. Right? Now it's a risky strategy, and you can see it because a lot of them died outside Portugal. Because, if you're going off into the unknown, it's risky. You end up, being killed or catching diseases that you're not immune to and all these kind of things. Or you drown at sea and what have you. But the result is these younger sons managed then to find themselves, sort of wealth and so on that they could use for, in effect, purchasing wives. Although it's not how it would have been interpreted, but made them attractive as marriage partners, through trading and through conquest elsewhere. And the contrast really is Venice at the same time, because Venice never went through this transition because Venice was based on trading. They had no land. There was no land. They didn't colonize anywhere. They just sent out trading missions, right? Now, the merit of trading is it doesn't matter how many sons you have. The more sons you have, the more trading you can do, because each one has a ship and goes somewhere else and brings stuff back. So Venice never had this problem. They became very rich, but they did it through trading, whereas the Portuguese and the Spanish, I guess, between them ended up sort of initiating this great age of exploration and then colonization as this sort of access to wealth and resources which weren't available to these younger sons back home. So, boys are troublesome, right? They're apt to be badly behaved at the best of times. And there's very nice evidence from criminal studies, whatever it's called, criminality. No, it's not the right word, is it? But
criminology.
Criminology, thank you very much. Always go to a Canadian if you want to know how to speak English, yes.
No. I'm learning a lot just listening to you. I'm trying my best just to keep up. But in criminology studies,
one of the classic findings that they have over and over again is a prisoner's chances of recidivism, that is going back into jail after he's been released, depends on whether or not he finds a wife and settles down. Because if he finds a wife and settles down, somehow she manages, not always, but sometimes, sort of more often than not, she manages to kind of create a psychological and social environment in which the need to go out and, I don't know, whatever they did before, rob, beat people up, just behave badly, is no longer so important. Of course, children, are quite helpful for that because, you clearly, even as a father, dare I say, you show some interest in the future of your children and bringing them up, and so you do all these things around the house and with the children that takes your mind off your enormous motorbike that you used to ride and annoy the village by revving up at 3 o'clock in the morning and these kind of things. So there's a kind of sense in which provide, sort of use the term marital, although it doesn't necessarily have to be formally involve marriage, of course, but the marital arrangements you have become important in holding the lid on the stresses created by particularly, but not exclusively, but particularly the males behaving badly. And we can see this actually in hunter-gatherer societies. I published a paper last year showing that the proportion of all deaths that were due to homicide, to murder, increased linearly with the size of the living group, the band. in hunter-gatherer societies. And the reason they live in these small groups of about 50, and very rarely bigger than that, is simply that once you get above 50, living groups, bands of about 50 people, adults and children included, the murder rate starts to get astronomical. And in fact...
why is that?
It's just the stresses of living together, and boys tend not to be... The red mist rises too quickly. They're in that sense, they're less... Girls are trying to find a social...
tempers wanting to do it their way.
Yeah.
And when you say, have a wife, I think what you're saying is back to the thoughts we had in conversation we had earlier about connection and community, and having that, the 5 people close to you and the 15 people close to you, gender notwithstanding, children notwithstanding, but having a tight social community prevents you from going back and, you are happier, you are living longer, you are healthier. So therefore you're less likely to be committing, crimes that cause you to go back into jail. So. And so you're partly saying that these large numbers of extra single guys we got in China and perhaps the world is a negative, I'm assuming, negative problem for our population as a whole. 8 billion is going to hit 9 or 10 and then come crashing down. And
one of the other features of marital systems is it produces a set of in-laws, which means you've got you double the size of the family, the kinship group, effectively, within which the couple are embedded, and therefore the boy is under much more social pressure, because now he's not just got his own family going, you shouldn't behave like that, but he's also got the in-laws, the wife's family going, that's a very bad way to behave. So the pressure on him to hold the lid down on his kind of bad behavior, if you like, is escalating. You can see how this actually comes into play very quickly in small-scale societies. Once they start to live in villages, that's one of the first steps, is you get formal marital arrangements whereby guys have to do marriage bridal service for their in-laws. So they have to go and live with their in-laws and help with their sheep, or help with their tilling their fields or harvesting their fields, or what have you, for several years. Because this establishes this much bigger police force, which just sits on them, squashes them anytime they put their head up above the parapet in a way that, is going to be destabilizing not only their relationship, because that's what the two families are interested in, of course, is the couple's relationship and their children, particularly, from an evolutionary point of view, but also the consequences for the community as a whole, that they don't destabilize the community too much. So there are all these kind of things, but the worry, in some sense, that I would have in the context of smaller families that we have now, is that these social networks we have really are kinship networks. If you look in small-scale societies, this grouping of 150 is entirely kin-based. They're either kin or they're in-laws. And that's because in these small-scale societies, the community or the village, everybody is related to everybody else, biologically or by marriage. So much so that if you, as an anthropologist, go out to study these people, until somebody, it's usually the chief of the village, takes you on, in your case, as an honorary son, but if it was a girl, as an honorary daughter, you have no place in the society, and therefore nobody will talk to you, because they don't know how to talk to you, because they don't know what your status is. Once you're taken on and you are the son of somebody or the daughter of somebody, as the anthropologist coming in from outside, now you have a position in society. Everybody knows how to interact with you, whether they can joke with you or not joke with you, and all these kind of things. So joking relationships, as they're known. So there is a sense in which, and it turns out that actually this size 150 is exactly what you'd expect to see in the living descendants of a set of great-great-grandparents, just two people
interesting.
marrying out and
Yeah.
the natural rates of birth that you get in hunter-gatherer type societies, that would produce 150 people in the living generation, the 3 generations of living generations from a pair of great-great-grandparents. And this is very interesting because what that does effectively is take you out to about second cousins. Now, no language in the world has names for people who are less closely related to you. Right? No language in the world.
There's no third cousins?
We have to do that kind of trick, but they don't use those. We can do that when we look at it now, if you like, as scientists, but there's no term used to specify that kind of relationship in any language. So there are 8 major kinship naming systems in the world, right?
Yeah.
Hawaiian.
Sorry, second cousins
Eskimo.
are like my parents and your parents are cousins.
Yes.
Then we're second cousins.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah. So it goes back to the fact that you're all descendants of this one apical pair of great-great-grandparents. You're all descended from them. So the fact that no language in the world has kinship naming system has a term to describe people outside that circle suggests that it really was based around kinship. And now here's the rub, because if you reduce family sizes, which is what we've all done after the demographic transition starting in the middle of the early 1800s in France, they were the people that first kicked this in. You end up with a 150 network, which is only half filled with relatives. In fact, certainly in the data we collected in Britain and Belgium, because that's where our original data sets came from for this, the number of extended family members in the 150 friends and family you had was almost exactly 50%. So 50%, so you had 75 family, because we give priority to family still. So people who come from big families and maybe have 40 first cousins, which is kind of not unusual if you've, had even...
somebody I have with my mom and my dad having lots of siblings.
Yeah, that's right.
But my kids have very few cousins.
Yes, yes. Well,
because my sister and my wife's sisters, have one or two kids. Right?
Okay, so that's the issue then, is that generation which ends up in these small families have to fill up half their. What you find, and certainly what we found in our data, and a lot of people have commented to me about this when I've given talks, is if you come from a big family, in the sort of normal case of standard European, North American tradition, as it were, of small families, you've still got the odd family with 40 first cousins, the outliers. But people who are in that situation will tell you they don't have any friends because it takes them all their time to get around their cousins, right? Because the collection of cousins is working like a peer group sort of a friendship thing. So they don't need friends. It's the people who have not many first cousins. I only have one, and he's dead, so I'm bereft. So I have to fill up all my slots with unrelated people, friends. And this is why a lot of these friendship relationships often seem to be very close. People will say, that my best friend is family to me, and things like that. Or, but of course they'll say the converse. My mother is my best friend,
and that's growing.
And that's growing.
That idea is growing in our culture.
Yeah,
because we have less family.
Yes,
and we're less close to each other.
Yes, and one consequence of that is derivative of the fact that we're much more mobile. So we're moving constantly during the course of our lifetime. You grow up in one city, you go to university in another city, you get your first job somewhere else. Your boss then says, why don't you go and run our office in Timbuktu or somewhere else like that? And so you're constantly moving around. Well, okay, your family component remains stable, even though they may be scattered around the country. But what you end up with is the friendship circles, instead of consisting of 75 friends, it consists of, 10 or 15 groups of 5 or 6 clusters of friends that you've met in different stages of your life trajectory, as it were, and they don't know each other, and they're scattered everywhere else around the country, right? So you only see them now and again. So you've lost this sense of the village in which everybody's embedded in the same community, and everybody is somehow related to everybody else. Of course, the relationship is different. Your mother is my auntie, and those kind of things, but still, everybody's positioned within some framework with the same group of people. You're ending up with a situation where people are much less embedded in these kind of communities, and therefore they have less respect for and obligation to the people amongst whom they live now, who are effectively strangers. Why should I'm making a noise with my party? Why should I care if it's bothering you? Whereas if you were in the village, your village consisted of your extended family, all great granny needed to do, sitting in her shawl by the fire, is lift a finger and wag it, and you behave.
Yes. Yeah, and I live in downtown Toronto, and I do a lot of walking, and I have a thing in my head called the dog shit index, and I feel like the more dog shit I see on the sidewalks, the less trusting the community and connectedness. So in my neighborhood, I'm lucky to say I pretty much never step in dog shit. But there's certain neighborhoods in Toronto, especially the newer neighborhoods with tall buildings where people don't know each other, and you can't walk two sidewalk steps without stepping in dog poo. And I'm like, this is a real sign of people just not caring about what other people have to deal with. Like it's just so visible. Yeah. And with population, some of the stuff we're talking about, it seems like a bigger and bigger issue in how we're living, choosing to live.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're absolutely quite right. I shall remember that one, and I shall use it frequently with attribution to you. No,
go ahead. It's yours. It's yours. This area of trust is an area I've been studying for a long time. I find it fascinating. Yeah. But unfortunately, to your point, it's very hard to put your finger on. And we know so much from the happiness research of what makes you happy, trusting communities, and we're not living like that purposely. We're choosing to. It's better to have a gated community and a detached home and be separated and living in your bubble. Look at how, sometimes I get flown to give speeches, and so do you. And what did a business class flight used to be? Used to be the chairs were beside each other and you talk to the people. Now everybody's incubated in their little cavern with no contact with anybody else. It's like so bizarre.
Yeah. And this is also a consequence of our pressured world in which your deadlines are just crushing you, and where in the past you would use that time to have a conversation and a drink or something with play a game of cards or whatever with other passengers, or what have you. In the old days, of course, on a ship where you couldn't do anything else, so you had to play deck games with them or something like that. Now, we're going, oh no, I've got a little space here and I've got these 3 deadlines. I've got time to talk to you. Leave me alone, wrap me in a bubble and keep me out of here. And it's destroying really the levels of trust that create the glue that holds society together.
Let's throw into that wonderful stew that we're building together here just the growing connection of technology to our hands, to our ears, to our faces. If you say to yourself, oh, I'm going to get on this plane, I'm going to talk to my neighbor, or I'm going to talk to the people at the park, or I'm going to make a point to connect with my, literally even the mailman has earbuds in their ears and they don't even hear you say hello.
Yes.
It's like we're so... And I think it's partly because the entertainment value of what's on TikTok far exceeds the entertainment value of talking to a random person about a random thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, I think. Mm.
And, here's one of my final... You're 76, if I have it right. I think your birthday's in February.
I believe so.
Dylan Thomas sadly died.
I prefer not to ask.
Okay, so we won't focus on your birthday, but I will say Dylan Thomas died at 39. I'm 45. I got my 50s and 60s ahead of me. With all your research on what makes people kind of live these, highly connected life. I mean, literally the cover of this book I'm holding says at the cup of it, I'm holding it up here, friendship, befriend, girlfriend, friendly, good friend, best friends, friend request, old friends, friends, the power of our most important relationships. What advice might you leave us with to help live, these decades that we're in this increasingly lonely age, with some of the pressures we talked about, work being a big part of it, as you mentioned. What are the ingredients to living a happy, healthy, long life? And from your experience in your 70s, could you tell us what to do in our 50s, in our 40s and 50s and 60s?
I wouldn't dare. But I will offer two bits of advice, I think. One is, at the end of the day, we spend an awful lot of time at work. If that work environment isn't a working social environment, not a work environment, but a functional social environment, you are going to be A, much lonelier because we spend so much time at work, B, have a lot more illness and therefore time off work, and your health is going to suffer, but also the organization or the business is going to suffer, and all your colleagues are going to suffer because they're having to cover for you. So everything's being done much less efficiently. Yes. So if the most, I will say this, but it'll probably annoy a lot of people. The most important function HR departments could serve is to completely rethink what they do and become the social engineers, not the social police, which is what they are now. You can't do this because it's against the law, or we must do that because we have to have some kind of tick box, diversity kind of thing, whatever. The answer is, that's just spending a lot of money ticking boxes to get nowhere. If they really wanted to do something useful, they would become the department for creating the workplace as a social environment, because then you'd have proper integration. Diversity would be just appear out of nowhere and function well because people were now interacting with each other rather than just sort of turning up and sitting in isolation. It would save billions of dollars from company budgets, which they're otherwise spending on sticking plasters at the moment.
And they're so scared now, right?
Terrifying,
they don't want to talk anything. Yeah. HR departments are scared because they got the Trump people on one side, the Biden people on one side. They work together, so they can't have any conversation between them. There's this fear. You have to have drinks together, karaoke. I just went to a conference where the whole 3 days the company just hung out. They didn't actually do anything.
Yes, exactly.
And it was so healthy for the culture. What was the second bit?
The second thing is kind of derivative of that, and that is, since a lot of people do this now, when you go to the gym and do your workout of a morning, or I suppose when you go for a jog, which many people do, instead of putting your headphones on as you pump iron there away at the machines, take your headphones off so you can talk to the person on the machine next to you. Or if you if you do jogging, go with somebody, go as a group, go with a friend. You won't, of course, you can't, if you're jogging, you can't necessarily do a lot of talking, although people do, but at the end of the time, jogging is hard work, so you tend to talk less. But the point is, if you do these physical activities in synchrony with each other, it builds up this sense of camaraderie and bonding in a magical sort of way. So you get, you get to be fit and to build friendships without actually having to do too much extra if you do your physical exercises as a social group. And that's an easy one.
Oh my God. Well, the amount of wisdom and research and knowledge you have thoughtfully and kindly shared through the lens of your 3 most formative books is just been so generous, and you do so with such a spirit of deep humility, which, if people saw how many letters are after your name, it's very rare that somebody of your education and your experience and your, what you've done and accomplished, you're coming at it from such a humble and gentle place. It's so appreciated, and I just can't thank you enough for doing this, Robin. It means a great deal to me and to our listeners, and it's very generous and kind of you. Thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure. It's been enormous fun to do it with you, and thank you for the invitation. I am honoured.
And it's been an honor to have you. Thank you so much for coming to 3 Books. It's Professor Robin Dunbar, Emeritus Professor of Oxford University. I'm holding 4 of his books right beside me, including Friends, Understanding the Power of Our Most Important Relationships, How Religion Evolved and Why It Endures, Evolution, What Everyone Needs to Know. My favorite of the 4, I will say, has How Many Friends Does One Person Need, Dunbar's Number, and Other Evolutionary Quirks. And I didn't even get to what I think is your most popular book, on grooming, right? I didn't even think I got to it because you've such a treasure trove, but so many ways to check out your work and your research. And I did mention other podcasts you've been on as well. Of course, Yuval Noah Harari's even made you into a character in the Sapiens graphic novel. You've permeated culture completely, and I hope that your work takes even greater hold as we navigate into healthier and happier lives together.
Thank you very much.
Hey everybody, it's just me, just Neil again, hanging out in my basement, not with my backpack full of wires as I usually have, but that's around the corner from where I am, but now I put on a pink jacket and I'm sitting in my studio because I'm trying to take a video of this at the same time. So if you're listening to this just on audio, that's kind of my preference for podcasts. Hopefully it sounds the same because I'm still in my basement, but if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see me now. This is my first ever visible outro, first ever visible end of the podcast club to follow. Okay, are you here with me? Did you make it this far? I wasn't sure how much to chop out of that conversation, and I talked to Craig, who's been wonderfully editing this show, and he's like, I found the whole thing really interesting. I mean, there's a lot of asides, but don't you feel like you could kind of listen to them all day? That's sort of the beauty of having a free-form conversation. You get to have the depth that comes from natural tangential bits, right? So anyway, I chopped out a couple of the longer asides that I don't think added, but it's still 3 hours. So there's a lot of juice in here. I mean, so many quotes jump out to me. I have so many picked out. I mean, just on trust, trust is absolutely fundamental to sociality, not just in humans, but in primates and other species too. Failure in relationships is almost always because of trust. Think about that. Not only your relationship with your spouse or your kids or your friendships, but also I think about relationships with brands or companies or the flight's delayed 5 times. Now I don't fly on Transat anymore or whatever. I don't mean to throw that company out under the bus. How about this quote? There was a study of the effects done on people working together in an office that went out, ate together, and it turns out this actually benefits the relationships in the organization. It's kind of there's a bit of a no shit quality to some of the stuff he says, but at the same time, no one does it, right? If you see I was in charge of CEO onboarding at Walmart for a time. So there's 18 CEOs around the country. My job was when a new CEO joined, the company, that could be CEO of Walmart Brazil, CEO of Walmart Japan, CEO of, Walmart England, whatever it was, Asda. What do they do in the first week, month, year? And so I was designing this CEO onboarding program. And one of the things I put in there was have dinner one-on-one with each of your direct reports. Sounds super obvious, but no one does it, right? If you're the incoming leader of a team, having a one-on-one dinner, so dinner is outside of work, dinner is by nature and definition, breaking bread, maybe casual clothes, you're talking about your families, and you do it one-on-one, so goes deeper into the relationship with each of your direct reports. Now you got them all on your team and you understand them and they understand you, and it's you just kind of tighten up. Unbelievably powerful. Again, not many people do it. How about this one? Religion dies during times of peace and revives during times of war. I really found that an insightful and thoughtful point. And, it's coming from a guy who's written a lot of books on religion, including this one I'm holding up right here, How Religion Evolved and Why It Endured. I've got the Pelican mass market paperback in my hand. The most important function, I know I'm doing more than 3 quotes here. The most important function HR departments could serve is to completely rethink what they do and become social engineers, not social police. How cool is that thought? it's not social police like rules, but it's more like, where can we create spaces and places and avenues for people to come together? Where do people hang out? How do we make the cafeteria really exciting? How do we make people want to come to the office? So that when you come to the office, and every company's different. I just had a conference call yesterday with the head of like Western U.S. sales for Coke and the head of U.S. sales for Mars. And these are companies that have invited me to give talks to their organizations. And I was talking to them and I was asking about their work from home policies, and both of them were, one of them was 50% work from home. You decide when you're going to come up. The other one I think was like 3 days a week. And I have a friend at Apple and it's 3 days a week. So like the tendency is like going up from like the 1 or 2 days now. Like you see it's now majority in the office for a lot of big companies. But how do you make people want to go? How do you make people want to do that, right? We know the benefits. We've just heard hours of talking about the benefits of like connecting. I remember my 10 years at Walmart, like the value of hallway conversations and lineup conversations and cafeteria conversation was gigantic. You ever hear somebody eating an egg salad sandwich 2 tables over talking about a big project they're working on that overlaps completely with the thing your boss told you to do, because both of their bosses walked out of the meeting with the CEO thinking that they are responsible for it. Like that kind of overlapping kind of stuff happens all the time in organizations, right? Anyway, I got lots more quotes. I just posted a whole bunch to Twitter. But they're all the quotes on 3books.co if you want to go check the show notes.
3books.co/chapters/132.
You can find all the quotes I pulled out. See if they match any of yours. Now, we got 3 more books to add to our top 1,000 here, including number 615, The Rise of the New Physics by Aram Dabro, D''Abro. I did not find that book. I did not read that book. There's like no reviews of it on Amazon. It's like one of those like $700 on eBay type of books, okay? Number 614, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig, Pirsig. This book I actually connected with when I was a teenager, and I read like, I want to say at least half of it then. I was really mesmerized by it, but something about the book then grated on me, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. So I rebought the book used from a used bookstore in Toronto. Shout out to used bookstores. And it struck me again that it was a great book. Like you could fall into it, but it's also like, I got it right here. It's a pretty thick and meaty book. Here, I'm holding it up for those that can see me on YouTube. And, it's 380 pages, and the writing is like super duper tiny, and I just couldn't make it through it. But it was formative to Robin Dunbar. It struck millions of people when it came out. And so if you're interested in a fabulous journey of man in search of himself, well, there you go. Do yourself a favor. Check out Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, a book that Neil has failed to get through now twice. No book shame, no book guilt. Number 613 is a book I did not fail to get through. As I lean and bend over to pick it up, I got through, and it was really good, really hard, but really magical. It is Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas. Like, isn't that cover really awesome just to stare at if you're watching me? I mean, first of all, when you read a play, you always think, oh, it's going to be super fast. Like, it's a play. Like, there's only like 100 words on a whole page, But this is so dense, so literarily dense, so like wordly dense. You heard that, Mr. Ogmore, Mr. Pritchard, it's time to inhale your balsam. Oh, Mrs. Ogmore. Oh, Mrs. Pritchard. Like, you heard that little snapshot we did, and it's all like that. And so the thing it makes me think of is that Beatles song, Because. You know that Beatles song, Because? Because the sky is blue, it makes me sad. There's the metaphor, there's the, the sky is blue. Blue is in the color, but blue also is in sad. It makes me sad. Because the wind, something like because the wind blows it, oh man, now I have to look up the lyrics to Because by the Beatles. Oh my gosh, how do I do this live? I'm doing it. Because the world is round, it turns me on. Because the wind is high, it blows my mind. Like, you can read that, and then you read it again, and then you read it again, and you're like, it's a bit of poetry, and it's powerful, and it's twisting, and the whole Under Milkwood is like that. Dylan Thomas, of course, best known for Rage Against the Dying of the Light. And that's number 613, Under Milkwood. So we added 3 more books to our top 1,000. And now, how are we going to do this in this form? I'm going to try. Okay. If you're still here, I want to welcome you back to the end of the podcast club, people. My first ever end of the... I feel like I should like change into like sweatpants and like go hang out on the couch and like hold up my phone above me and like a sort of like intimate, you know, I don't know. There's something kind of weird about that too, though, don't you think? I mean, theater of the mind is sort of my thing. But anyway, welcome back if you're here to the end of the podcast club. This is the club where I talk directly to you. You talk directly to me. We play your voicemails. We read your letters. And we do the word etymology thing of an interesting word said by one of our guests. We have fun. We hang out together. It's the after party for the show. It's one of 3 clubs we have for 3 books listeners, including the Cover to Cover Club. If you're a Cover to Club member, we've just started taking names. You can email me or email Craig. Just email Craig. Email Craig at globalhappiness.org. Anywhere, our emails are on the website. Email us, let us know your name, and we add you to the list. We're starting to keep a list of Cover to Cover Club members. That's people that have attempted to listen to every single chapter of 3 books. It's a 333 chapter book, right? So we're only on chapter 126. We're just over a third of the way through here. I know it's been on 6 years, but we got a lot to go. And then there's also the secret club members. I can't say more about that, but you can call our phone number 1-833-READ-A-LOT for clues. Speaking of that phone number, let's go to the phones now.
Hi, Neil. This is Sherry McDaniel. I'm calling from McKinney, Texas, in the USA. And I love your podcast so much. I tried to call last week on this number a couple of times, and it didn't go through, but today it's going through. So I'm very happy to get through. Anyway, love your podcast. Keep it up. I just started listening this year, and I'm going back and doing all your early ones one by one. And I've started reading a lot more. And right now I'm into Jodi Picoult, trying to read all her books. She's awesome. Anyway, I really like your show, and I recommend it to everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much to Sherry McDaniel for calling from McKinney, Texas. Is it just me, or is Texas somewhat emerging as another new heart center of the show? I mean, for like a while, it was like San Diego. I mean, I always thought it was in Toronto where I started, but then, you know, San Diego people started calling in a lot, and now we're getting like a lot of Texas. Like, shout out to Joey down in Texas. Shout out to Brené Brown down in Texas, chapter 70. Jenny Lawson, chapter 76. Austin Kleon, chapter 111, also known as 111, which we did live in Texas, in Austin, Texas, with Austin Kleon. Anyway, lots of Texans have been on the show, is what I'm saying. Never mind Martellus Bennett. Almost forgot Martellus Bennett. Susie Batiz, 123. Oh my gosh. No wonder. There's a Texan footprint happening here. Sherry, Jodi Picoult is a big. You said I tried to call Leslie a couple times, which I liked, and Jodi Picoult is one of Leslie's favorite writers. So you guys have that in common. And I like that you're going back to chapter 1 and starting from the beginning. Again, Cover to Cover Club members are people who attempt every chapter. Like, you might get half an hour into some guest and be like, I don't like this guest. Or you might be like, I don't like Neil's vibe this day. We are different people every day, right? So we're adding you. That's my point here, Sherry. We're adding you officially to the Cover to Cover Club member list. Woohoo! That will be added to our list on FAQ. Look, we should have started this list 5 years ago, but we're starting it now. So email us, drop us a line, send us a tweet, just send a smoke signal. Let us know if you want to be added to the list. Okay. I was thinking about putting together like a little periodic table type 333 chapter type punch card for people to cross off or X or click like a buttonhole when they do that. I still might. Papercut Club members, you know what I'm talking about. And if you don't know what the Papercut Club is, it's an entirely analog fan club that we've created just for 3 bookers. The only way to find out more about it is by calling 1-833-READ-A-LOT. And when you call 1-833-READ-A-LOT, which I love you to do, leave us the name of one of your formative books. Okay, or a dream guest or something, you know, that we could just talk about because we're hanging out. That's the whole point. All right. And now it is time for a letter of the chapter. So this chapter's letter comes from Nikki Willis. Nikki says, been utterly delighted to find this podcast. Only disappointed that it took so long. I first heard an episode in May and gone back to listen to all the real-time chapters. Oh my gosh, we got to add Nikki Willis to the cover. This is the problem. I'm just like making notes here. I love reading, always have. I feel most like myself in a library or a bookshop. It's so affirming to find a community of others who find fun and joy from books. And I'm grateful for the hard work that goes into making this podcast. You are so welcome. Listen, here's the thing. Reading is at threat, 57% of Americans read 0 books last year. And if that number shocks or surprises you, maybe it should, because that number's doubled since the 1980s. And of course, you're like, well, now there's TikTok and, now there's YouTube. Aren't you making a YouTube video right now, Neil? Yeah, but still, nothing compares to reading. Like, it's as simple as that. Nothing compares to reading. Nothing gives us the vast suite of emotions available in books, because you're feeling inside yourself, because it's telepathic communication, because it's how they put the words together, how they chose them, and why they chose them that way, and did they invent new ones, and are they twisting there's so much going on. David Foster Wallace famously said, I use more of myself while writing than doing anything else. We have an upcoming conversation that I'm excited to tease right now with Susan Orlean, and we go deep into this topic. Reading's at threat. So finding your tribe or your community amongst 3 bookers who geek out on books and life and how to live great, long, healthy, intentional lives by discussing and pulling out the wisdom from books. Hell yeah, sister. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing too. Like, the reason I started this show is so I can hang out with you. Like, we wouldn't have met. So this is awesome. This is what it's all about. Can you feel us like getting closer and closer together? Like, maybe you were a 5,000 friend. Now you're a 500. Maybe you're 150. And then eventually you're going to call me in the middle of the night. I'm going to race over because, your kid needs to get rushed to the hospital. Then I'll be one of your 15s or one of your 5s. Okay, we're getting deeper and deeper now. Okay, so we got a letter. We covered. I'm a little bit more disoriented because I'm trying to videotape this at the same time. But okay, so you can let me know how this goes. 1-833 read a lot. And now I'm going to do the word of the chapter. And for this chapter's word, you better believe we're getting a sound cloud, a word cloud treatment. Let's head back to Mr. Robin Dunbar.
Clan or a local community. Until the Neolithic, when some kind of anonymous hive is deluged with rain, is peppered with allusions and metaphors of the brain, the neocortex in particular, stuck in eddies. And because I was kind of thinking I might be fatwad, but it's constantly throwing googlies at us is the cause of heretical beliefs. Control system, it's an opiate. We interpret them as a kind of avatar. Consequences of sex kind of bubbling up from the bungalow, you name, of recidivism, that is, of this one apical, Timbuktu or somewhere else.
Okay, that was a pretty epic word cloud we got there. You kind of get that when you get septuagenarian Oxford Emeritus Professors in general, I would say. We will find out when we next have one on the show. And there's a lot of words I left out there, by the way, that could have easily been added, like including like he says like he says like Sikhs, Parsis, Ismaili, like a lot of like tribes and cultures, ascetics, like that whole kind of like proper nouns I left out. And we were talking about like the Hindi origin of words like shampoo and loot and pajamas, which I thought was really fascinating. Like, maybe we should do shampoo. Should we do shampoo? Like, that would be kind of fun. Shampoo, yeah, it's an 18th century word that means massage from the Hindi word shampoo, which means press. Oh, that's a pretty good one. Yeah, the first origin of shampoo came from the Indus Valley. That's what he said. A very effective early shampoo made by boiling sapindas with dried Indian gooseberry and a selection of other herbs. Well, shout out to India for coming up with shampoo. No one saw that coming. Okay, that's a little funny. I'm just kind of joking because, well, I feel like that's like one. Anyway, we're not gonna do shampoo. We're gonna do googly. 'Cause that's what after the elaborate tease of a different word, we're gonna go with googly. Googly. Googly, come on, Merriam-Webster, are you going to be able to pull this up for us? Because, Google has kind of taken over the Googl words, right? Like, as soon as you hear Google, you think Google, the company. And if you think of another word after that, you think Google, the number, like a 1 with 100 zeros after. Or maybe you think Googleplex, because, of course, Google, like, in addition to repurposing the number, Google. Hey, is that another number named after a person? Shout out to Avogadro. Might be. Yeah, I think it would be. And I'm sure he's dead. Then you got the Googleplex. But you haven't really heard of googly. And guess what? It is such a small word that even Merriam-Webster does not have a sound of it. Googly, Googly. Googly, Googly. L-Y, okay? It means an off break in cricket with a leg break action. What? Yeah, in cricket, a googly, which is a Googly, I want to get the name off of the corporate behemoth here. It's a type of delivery bowled by a right arm leg spin bowler. It's different from the normal delivery for a leg spin bowler in that it is turned the other way. The googly is not a variation of the typical off spin, and that the cricket ball is presented from the bowler's hand in such a way that once the ball pitches, instead this one deviates in the opposite direction of a leg spin. It's also been colloquially referred to as a wrong'un or a bosey or a bossy, with the later two eponyms referring to Bernard Bosanquet, the bowler who originally devised and began using the googly. Here is, if you're watching this on YouTube, here's a picture of the guy doing a googly, and he's got this like one arm over his head with like his wrist, like it looks like about to snap backwards. Yes, indeed, that became a googly. I kind of like that. Googly, Googly. I can't think of any other Google type words now. The weird cricket throw is firmly implanted in my brain, taking its rightful place to retake over Googl words everywhere. Thank you all so much for listening to chapter 126 of 3 books. If you watch this on YouTube, you watched my very first ever full-length video. I've had some other videos, but my intros and outros were never videos. Here I am on intro and outro doing videos. Does it work? I have no idea. Let me know. 1-833-READ-A-LOT or drop me a line. Okay. So, until next time, everybody, until
Chapter 133.
I usually throw a little tease in here. Let's put it this way. Have you checked out the Oscar nominations? Did you see the name Past Lives on a whole bunch of stuff? Yeah, Past Lives is my favorite movie of 2023. It was directed by Celine Song, the brand new first-time filmmaker who's just like catapulting to great heights. She is only in her 30s, and she is a filmmaker of this artistic everything. If you saw the movie Past Lives, wonderful. If you haven't seen Past Lives yet, please go see it, and then tune in on chapter
133
when Celine Song joins us live, and it will be another video experiment, that's for sure. Okay, everybody, until next time, remember that you are what you eat, and you are what you read. Keep turning that page, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.